She did not know that the worst words ever spoken over her life would also be the ones that finally led her home. The fire in the hearth at St. Agatha's Orphanage had been dying since morning, and no one had thought to feed it. That was the nature of the place. Things that needed tending were left to wither quietly, and the children learned early that they were among those things. The year was 1842, and London beyond the orphanage's warped wooden windows was already deep in the gray throat of November, the kind of cold that did not merely chill the skin, but settled into the bones like an unwanted tenant with nowhere else to go. But before we go any further into this story, one of secrets buried in portrait galleries, of inheritance stolen by silence, and of a love neither of them expected and neither could outrun, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city, your country, your little corner of the earth in the comments below, because stories like this one deserve to be witnessed by people who feel them. And if this is your first time here, please like this video, share it with someone who loves a good historical romance, and subscribe to this channel, because we tell the kinds of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, back to the girl in the corner. Her name, as far as St. Agatha's was concerned, was Alara. Just Alara. The matron, a stout woman named Mrs. Crail who smelled permanently of camphor and mild contempt, had written it in the admission ledger 3 years prior in handwriting that suggested she had not much cared about the spelling. There was no surname recorded. There was no age confirmed. There were no relatives listed, no origin noted. No explanation given beyond the brief and dismissive annotation scratched beside her name, delivered by arrangement. Fee paid in full. No correspondence to be forwarded. Alara had read that entry herself once in the blue dark hour before dawn when Mrs. Crail's office was unlocked and the rest of the orphanage slept. She had stood in the cold in her stockings and read it 3 times, as though repetition might squeeze more meaning from those sparse, indifferent words. It had not. She had returned to her cot, pulled the thin blanket to her chin, and stared at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a person who has decided that feeling something deeply in private is the only luxury left to them. She was 17 now, by her own estimation, tall for it, and slender in the way that came not from elegance, but from years of meals that never quite satisfied. Her hair was the color of dark autumn leaves, a deep reddish brown that she kept plaited tightly back, because loose hair attracted attention, and attention at St. Agatha's was rarely the benevolent kind. Her eyes were gray, not the pale, watery gray of overcast skies, but a deeper shade, the gray of old stone, of river water in winter, of something that had once been another color entirely, and had learned to hold itself still. The other girls called her quiet. The matron called her peculiar. Neither was untrue. It was on the 14th of November that the carriage arrived. Alara heard it before she saw it, the particular strike of well-shod horses on cobblestone, the creak and authority of a vehicle that cost more than St. Agatha's earned in a year. She was in the common room, seated at the far end of the long table, ostensibly mending a stocking, but in truth reading the pamphlet she had folded and tucked beneath it, a geological survey of the southern English countryside that she had found abandoned in the matron's waste bin and considered a magnificent prize. The other girls rushed to the windows. This was not uncommon. Visitors meant the possibility of choosing, and choosing meant escape, and every child at St. Agatha's, regardless of how they masked it, wanted, with a ferocity they barely dared name, to be chosen. Alara did not go to the window. She had learned in her first month at the orphanage that hope was a resource to be rationed with extreme care. She had watched girls press their faces to cold glass and come away with nothing but the fog of their own breath and a fresh bruise on the part of themselves that kept wishing anyway. She had decided, quietly and completely, that she would not be among them. So she sat and she mended her stocking, and she read about limestone formations in Dorset, and she waited for whatever was coming to arrive on its own terms. It did not take long. Mrs. Crail swept into the common room with the particular energy she reserved for wealthy visitors. Her back straight, her expression rearranged into something she imagined resembled warmth. Behind her came a man. He was tall. That was the first thing. The way his height reorganized the dimensions of the room. The way the low doorframe seemed almost an insult to him. He wore a coat of charcoal wool so well cut it seemed almost architectural, and his boots were the deep glossy black of things that had never once known a puddle. His hair was dark and somewhat overlong for a man of Evan station, curling slightly at the collar in a way that seemed less like intention and more like something he had stopped bothering to correct. His jaw was sharp. His mouth was set in a line that suggested he found the entire endeavor mildly distasteful and wished to have it concluded. He was, objectively, a striking man. Elara noted this the way she noted most things, cataloging it calmly, assigning it its proper weight, and moving on. His eyes swept the room. They were dark eyes, nearly black in the thin winter light, and they moved across the assembled girls with an assessment so dispassionate it made Elara think of a man inspecting livestock at a country fair, not with cruelty, precisely, but with a complete absence of sentiment that was somehow worse. He was not looking for a child to love. He was looking for a condition to satisfy. Mrs. Crail was speaking. Elara caught fragments. Generous benefactor, Lord Ashford. Terms of the late Earl's will, charitable provision. All the comfortable language adults draped over uncomfortable transactions to make them palatable. The girls had arranged themselves in the hopeful, unconscious way they always did. The younger ones to the front, the prettiest ones angling their chins upward, shoulders squared, eyes bright with a terrible wanting of it. Elara stayed where she was. Lord Ashford, for that, apparently, was who this man was, moved slowly through the room. He looked at the fair-haired girl near the window, who smiled her most winning smile. He looked at the twins by the fireplace, who clutched each other's hands. He looked at the girl with the copper ringlets, who had been at St. Agatha's the longest and deserved, by any reasonable accounting, to leave it first. He looked at none of them for more than 2 seconds. And then his gaze, moving with the methodical patience of a man who had not found what he was looking for, reached the far end of the table. It reached Elara. She did not smile. She did not straighten. She held his gaze with the level, unhurried steadiness that had unnerved every matron and visitor who had encountered it. The gaze of a person who had been looked through so many times they had stopped performing for the looking. Something shifted in his expression. It was not warmth. It was not recognition. It was something harder to name. A brief, almost imperceptible interruption in the smooth machinery of his disinterest. He turned to Mrs. Crail. "That one," he said. His voice was low, and even the voice of a man who rarely needed to raise it to be heard. Mrs. Crail blinked. "My lord, that is, she is a rather quiet girl, not particularly. That is to say, there are other girls who might better suit." "I don't require one that suits," he said, with a patience that was really a form of impatience wearing better clothes. "I require one that fulfills the terms of the arrangement. She is of appropriate age. We believe so, my lord, approximately 17, though we cannot be entirely. Then she will do." He glanced once more at Elara, and in that glance was something that would have stung a girl less practiced in receiving indifference. "The plain one will do." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Elara heard them. Every girl in the room heard them. Mrs. Crail had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable before the economics of the situation smoothed her expression back into compliance. Elara set down her mending. She folded her pamphlet. She rose from the bench with the particular quietness that was her only armor and her greatest weapon, and she looked at Lord Dorian Ashford across the length of that cold, dim room. She did not flinch. She did not weep. She simply looked at him, with those gray stone eyes, that still face, that quality of absolute, unreadable composure. And she thought quite clearly and quite calmly, words she would never speak aloud. "You have no idea who you have just taken." Neither, it must be said, did she. But the answer was already waiting for them both, patient and inevitable as winter, in the east wing of Ashford Hall. The carriage that carried Elara away from St. Agatha's Orphanage did not wait for her to say goodbye, which was perhaps just as well, because there was very little at St. Agatha's worth the ceremony of farewell. She had been given 20 minutes to gather her things, a courtesy that Mrs. Crail extended with the brisk efficiency of a woman relieved to reduce her head count by 1. 20 minutes was, in fact, more than sufficient. Elara owned almost nothing. There was the gray wool dress she stood in, and one other, A faded brown one with a mended hem that had been mended so many times the original fabric was now more ghost than substance. There were 2 pairs of stockings, one with a hole she had not yet finished closing. There was a stub of pencil she had been hoarding for months. There was a small water-stained book of English poetry, Keats mostly, with some Wordsworth in the back, that she had found beneath a floorboard in her second week and claimed as her own with the solemn conviction of a conqueror planting a flag. And there was the other thing. The thing she kept not in her small cloth bag, but on her person, tucked into the lining of her dress, where she had unpicked 3 stitches to create a narrow pocket just wide enough to hold it. A button. It was not an ordinary button. It was made of deep blue enamel, ringed in gold, and on its face was a crest, a small, intricate crest, that she had spent 3 years studying without being able to identify. It had been in the pocket of the dress she was wearing when she arrived at St. Agatha's. The dress itself had been taken from her and replaced with the institution's standard gray, but not before she had removed the button with the careful, determined fingers of a girl who understood instinctively that some things must not be surrendered. She did not know what the crest meant. She did not know why she had it. She knew only that it was real, and that it was hers, and that in a life stripped of nearly every proof of origin, it constituted something close to evidence. Evidence of what? She could not yet say. She descended the front steps of St. Agatha's with her cloth bag held at her side and her back very straight. She did not look back at the building. She had a theory, developed over 3 years of quiet observation, that looking back at things that had diminished you gave them a power over your memory that they had not earned. She looked forward at the carriage, at the gray London street slick with November rain, at the footman who stood holding the door open with the particular blankness of a man paid to convey people from one place to another without forming opinions about them. Lord Ashford was already inside. He did not look up when she entered. He was reading a folded newspaper held with the focused attention of a man who had decided the interior of a carriage was an entirely satisfactory place to be and required no additional content. He sat on the far side, long legs extended at an angle that suggested the carriage had been built for smaller men, and he had made a private accommodation with this limitation. His coat was unbuttoned now, revealing a dark waistcoat beneath, a white cravat tied with a kind of precise simplicity that took either a very skilled valet or a very particular man to achieve. Alara sat across from him. The door was closed. The carriage moved. He did not speak. Neither did she. This arrangement suited Alara entirely. She turned her attention to the window, watching London perform its gray November theater. The street vendors hunched against the cold, the gaslit shop fronts swimming in the fog, the great dark river visible briefly between buildings as they crossed southward, wide and indifferent as always, carrying its cargo of silt and secrets toward the sea. She pressed the facts of the city into her memory with a methodical deliberateness, the way a person might press flowers, preserving what was passing because they could not be certain when they would see it again. She had never left London. She had not known, until this moment, that this fact had weight. It was somewhere past the city's edge, where the buildings thinned and the road widened, and the flat gray sky suddenly had room to be enormous, that Lord Ashford lowered his newspaper. He did not fold it with any particular ceremony. He set it beside him and looked at her, not the brief, assessing look from the orphanage, but a longer one, in the manner of a man who has purchased something and now, in better light, is conducting a more thorough inventory. Alara allowed it. "You read," he said. It was not a question. His eyes had dropped briefly to the book visible at the top of her bag, the Keats, and returned to her face. "Yes," she said. "What else?" "I beg your pardon? What else can you do?" "Read, presumably write. What else?" His tone was not unkind. It was efficient. The tone of a man compiling a list. Alara considered the question with the seriousness it perhaps did not deserve. "I can do arithmetic to a reasonable standard. I speak some French, self-taught, so likely imperfect. I understand basic principles of botany and geology from whatever reading material presented itself. I sew adequately. I am a poor singer and do not attempt it. I have no accomplishments that would impress a drawing room, if that is what you are asking." He regarded her for a moment. Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but the faint physiological precursor to it, the ghost of an expression that had perhaps once been more frequent and had since been rationed into near extinction. "I wasn't," he said, and returned to his newspaper. Ilara returned to the window. She had spoken more words in that exchange than she typically produced in a full day at St. Agatha's, and she took a moment to examine how that felt. Not unpleasant. She was not, by nature, a silent person. She was a person who had learned silence as a protective measure, the way certain creatures learn camouflage, and wore it now with the unself-conscious ease of long habit. But she had a mind that moved constantly, that pressed against the confines of available conversation the way water pressed against a dam, and she was aware that in a different life, in some other arrangement of circumstances she could not quite picture, she might have been rather the opposite of quiet. She pressed her fingers against the hidden button through the fabric of her dress. She thought about the woman who had brought her to St. Agatha's. She had been 14, and the memory was incomplete in the way that memories formed under duress so often are fragmented. The edges burned away, certain details impossibly vivid against a background of blur. She remembered carriage, different from this one, older, the interior smelling of violet water and something else, something medicinal and faintly bitter. She remembered a woman's hands, gloved in dark gray, holding hers across the seat. She remembered that the woman had wept, or nearly wept, that her face behind the veil had been the face of a person performing steadiness over something that was not steady at all. She remembered one sentence. She had carried it inside her for 3 years like a coal that would not cool. Asterisk, this is not what I want for you. You must believe that this is not what I want. Asterisk. And then, St. Agatha's. The ledger. No correspondence to be forwarded. And the woman, whoever she was, whatever she was, had vanished. Ilara did not know if she was alive. She did not know if she was someone who had loved her or someone who had simply been paid to place her somewhere. The problem was that both seemed possible. She could not reconcile the weeping with the abandonment. She had spent 3 years failing to reconcile them, and she had eventually arrived at a position she found livable. She would not conclude anything until she had more information, and she would gather more information by whatever means were available to her. Lord Ashford's household, she was already thinking, would contain information. All households did. It was stored in letters, in ledgers, in the overheard conversations of servants, in the particular silences that fell in certain rooms at the mention of certain names. She had learned to read households the way she read texts, with patience and attention to what was not said as much as what was. She looked again at the man across from her. He was reading. He was, apparently, entirely unbothered by her presence. She had the distinct and faintly irritating impression that he had filed her away somewhere in his mind, marked matter, attended to, and redirected his full attention elsewhere. She was, as he had said, simply the one who would do. She thought about those words. The plain one will do. She turned them over, examining them from different angles, the way she examined everything unfamiliar. They had been meant to reduce her. She understood that, not from bitterness, but from clear-eyed recognition of how such words functioned, what work they were designed to do. They were the words of a man who needed to make a transaction feel smaller than it was, who needed to not be seen choosing, who needed the girl in the corner to remain the girl in the corner. The trouble was, Ilara had never in her life managed to remain what other people needed her to be. She could perform it. She was very good at performing it. But performance was not permanence, and she had learned that the difference mattered enormously. Outside the window, London had entirely disappeared. The countryside opened around them now in long, cold sweeps of field and hedgerow, the bare November trees standing like dark writing against a pale sky. The road wound through it all with the unhurried confidence of something that had known where it was going for centuries. Ilara did not know where she was going, but she had the button. She had the memory of the gray-gloved hands. She had a mind that would not rest and a patience that did not flinch. And she was, she thought, looking at the back page of Lord Ashford's newspaper, at the shipping notices, at the legal announcements, at the dense small print columns that most people skipped entirely, going somewhere that contained answers. She could feel it with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone who asked, a low, steady certainty, like a compass needle swinging northward. She was going somewhere she had, without knowing it, always been going. And whatever that meant, whatever was waiting in the fog-wrapped halls of Ashford, she would not look away from it. She had not come this far by looking away. Ashford Hall did not announce itself gradually, the way modest places did. It arrived all at once, sudden and absolute, materializing from the fog like a thought too large for the mind that produced it. Alara saw it first through the carriage window as they crested a long, slow rise in the road, and whatever she had been preparing herself to feel, a practical neutrality, the careful management of expectation that had served her so well at St. Agatha's, did not quite hold. The building was immense in the particular way of old English houses that had been added to across generations by men who believed that grandeur was a form of argument. The main facade was pale stone, darkened at the edges by decades of English weather, rising to a roofline of chimneys and parapets that disappeared at their upper edges into the low gray cloud as though the house had no real top but simply continued upward into sky. Wings extended on either side. The western one lit at its lower windows with a warm amber of lamps, the eastern one dark, its windows reflecting nothing but the pale nothing of the afternoon. The grounds between the road and the house were formal in their bones, but November wild in their surface. Topiary shapes grown slightly beyond their intended geometry. Gravel drives edged with the skeletal remains of summer plantings. A stone fountain at the entrance circled dry and holding a shallow disk of rainwater in its basin. An oak stood to the left of the main doors, enormous and ancient. Its bare branches spread, so wide they seemed less like the arms of a tree and more like a claim staked against the sky. It was taken altogether, one of the most beautiful and one of the most melancholy things Alara had ever seen. She said nothing. She had learned not to say the things that moved her in front of people who had not invited her movement. The carriage drew up to the entrance, and a footman appeared with the speed of the well-trained before the wheels had fully stopped. Lord Ashford descended first, exchanging a word with someone Alara could not yet see, a low, brisk exchange of the kind that happens between a man and his household when he has been away and there is business to attend to. He did not look back to see whether Alara had descended. She descended. The air outside the carriage was cold in a different way than London cold. Cleaner, emptier, carrying across it the smell of wet earth and with smoke and something that might have been the distant hint of horses. Alara stood on the gravel and looked up at Ashford Hall and felt, with a peculiarity she could not account for and would not examine too closely in this exposed moment, that the house looked back at her. "You'll want to come inside before you freeze." The voice belonged to a woman who had appeared in the doorway, a compact, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 55, with iron-gray hair pulled severely from a face that had been handsome in youth and had settled into something better in age, a face of authority and contained intelligence, the lines of it suggesting a person who had seen a great deal and arrived at considered opinions about most of it. She wore the dark dress and chatelaine of a senior housekeeper, and she held herself with the particular dignity of a woman who runs a household of this size and knows, precisely and without apology, that she is the reason it runs at all. "Mrs. Brant," Lord Ashford said, not a greeting precisely, but an acknowledgment. "My lord," she returned, with a courtesy that managed to convey both respect and a robust equality of character. Her eyes moved to Alara. They did what eyes often did in those first seconds, conducted their assessment. But where most assessments Alara had endured were exercises in dismissal. This one had a different quality. It paused. It returned. It looked a second time with an attention that was not cataloging deficiency, but reaching for something, as though matching a face to a half-remembered description. "This is the ward," Lord Ashford said, already half-turned toward the interior. "See that she's settled. The east bedroom in the blue room," Mrs. Brant said, firmly enough that it was not a suggestion. There was a brief pause. Ashford turned back fractionally, as though the contradiction had not been what he expected from the direction it came. "The east bedroom," he repeated, with the patience of a man who was also issuing a correction. "The blue room is warmer and has been aired," Mrs. Brant said, in the tone of a woman who has managed this house for 22 years and intends to manage it for 22 more. The east corridor is damp in November. You know this. Another pause. Something passed across Ashford's face. Not quite surrender, not quite amusement, but the expression of a man who has chosen his battles across a long acquaintance and knows when he is on the losing side of one. The blue room, he said, and walked inside. Mrs. Brant turned to Alara with an expression that had shifted, the professional composure still entirely present, but beneath it, something attentive and specific, as though she was listening to something Alara had not yet said. "Come in, child," she said, and her voice had dropped half a register, taken on a quality that Alara, who was finely calibrated to register warmth in people who offered very little of it, noticed immediately. "You must be cold." Alara was cold. She followed Mrs. Brant through the front doors and into the entrance hall of Ashford, and the warmth of the interior came forward to meet her like a physical thing. The smell of beeswax and coal fire and old wood, the hush of high ceilings above stone floors, softened by long rugs, the amber light of oil lamps in their wall fixtures, doing their steady best against the early dark of a November afternoon. She looked up. The entrance hall rose 2 stories, the staircase sweeping upward in a broad curve from the right side of the space, its balusters dark and polished, the wall beside it hung with paintings. Portraits, mostly. The collected faces of the Ashford lineage watching the entrance hall, with the particular combined authority of people who knew that this place was theirs before you arrived and would remain so after you left. She catalogued them as she passed. Men in the dress of previous centuries, women in elaborate arrangements of lace and pearl, children painted in the stilted manner of an era that did not quite know how to depict childhood. She did not find what she would later learn to look for, not yet. That discovery was waiting for her elsewhere. Lord Ashford had already disappeared through a door to the left of the staircase that closed with the soft, definitive sound of a man retreating to the part of his life that did not require explanation or attendance. Alara watched the closed door for a moment and then looked away. Mrs. Brant led her up the stairs, through a wide corridor hung with more paintings and flanked by closed doors, and at last into a room that surprised her. It was called the Blue Room, and the name was honest. The walls were papered in a soft, layered blue, like the inside of a winter sky before the light fully leaves, the curtains a deeper tone, the bedding white and ample in a way that Alara, who had slept under a thin institutional blanket for 3 years, found almost excessive. A fire had been lit and was already well established in the grate. There was a dressing table, a wardrobe, a small writing desk by the window. The window itself looked out over the back gardens, and beyond them to a line of trees that stood at the edge of a field, dark and patient. Alara stood in the center of the room and said nothing for a moment. "The washing water will come up shortly," Mrs. Brant said from the doorway. "Dinner is at 7. His lordship takes it in the dining room, but does not expect you to. I can have a tray sent up until you're more accustomed." "Thank you," Alara said. "I'll come down." If she was to learn anything about this house, she would not learn it from a tray in her bedroom. Mrs. Brant looked at her again with that quality of attention that was beginning to feel less like scrutiny and more like something Alara had no ready word for. Recognition seemed too strong. "And yet, Mrs. Brant," Alara said, because she was not a girl who, when she sensed a question could be asked, left it unasked. "You looked at me in a particular way when I arrived. More than once." The housekeeper was quiet for a moment. A different woman might have deflected or denied or offered a brisk reassurance and closed the question. Mrs. Brant did none of these things. She looked at Alara with a steadiness that answered, in some measure, even before she spoke. "You remind me of someone," she said finally. "That is all." "Who?" Alara asked. Another pause. The fire in the grate shifted, settling, sending a brief pulse of warmth across the room. "Someone who was here a long time ago," Mrs. Brant said carefully, and her voice had a quality in it now, not grief exactly, but the specific gravity of a person who has kept something for so long that the keeping has become part of the weight of her days. "Someone it was not my place to ask questions about, and not my place to speak of without more certainty than I have." She held Alara's gaze for a long moment. "Settle yourself tonight," she said. "Rest. There will be time." She left. The door closed quietly. Alara stood for a moment in the warm blue room, the fire at her back, the dark window, before her, reflecting her own gray eyes. She reached through the fabric of her dress and pressed her fingers against the small, hard shape of the enamel button. The crest she could not identify. The woman she could not locate. The sentence she carried like a coal. "This is not what I want for you." She looked at the house outside the window. The dark line of trees, the frost beginning to form at the edges of the grass in the last of the light. She looked at the room around her, its blue walls, its generous fire, its strange, inexplicable sense of having been waiting. She thought of Mrs. Brandt's face. Someone who was here a long time ago. She thought of Lord Ashford's eyes in the orphanage, that brief, unreadable interruption in his disinterest. She thought of the dark east corridor he had mentioned and the wing that had stared back from the driveway, with its lightless windows. She sat on the edge of the generous bed and opened her Keats and did not read a single word of it. She was already listening to the house. And she had the strong, settled compass needle certainty that the house, in its walls and its portraits and its sealed eastern rooms, was already beginning, in its old stone way, to answer. There are certain prohibitions that function in practice as invitations, and Alara had understood this principle long before she had the vocabulary to name it. At St. Agatha's, the locked cabinet in Mrs. Crale's office had contained, among other things, a set of admission ledgers dating back 40 years. Alara had read all of them. The shelf of books in the matron's sitting room marked not for the girls had contained a medical text, a volume on criminal law, and a rather lurid Gothic novel that Alara had found instructive in different ways than its author had perhaps intended. Prohibition, she had concluded through consistent empirical observation, was simply a map with a destination already marked. The East Wing, therefore, was never a question of whether. It was only a question of when. She gave it 4 days. 4 days to learn the rhythms of Ashford Hall, which floorboard spoke and which stayed silent, which doors were habitually left open and which pulled closed on principle, when the housemaids moved through which corridors, and at what hours the house entered its particular nighttime quiet. She spent those days observing and cataloging with the focused patience of a naturalist in a new terrain, and she did it while appearing, to every person who glanced at her, to be doing nothing more remarkable than adjusting to her new surroundings. She came to dinner each evening, as she had told Mrs. Brandt she would. The dining room was large and formal and faintly absurd for 2 people. The table long enough to seat 20, Alara and Lord Ashford placed at adjacent ends like punctuation marks at opposite corners of a sentence too long to be useful. He ate with the efficient distraction of a man who considered meals an interruption to other things. He read at dinner, not the newspaper now, but documents, letters, things with the look of a state business. And he engaged her in conversation infrequently and briefly, in the manner of a man meeting an obligation rather than exercising a preference. On the first evening, he asked whether the blue room was satisfactory. She said it was. On the second evening, he told her, without looking up from his documents, that there was a library on the ground floor to the right of the entrance hall, and she was permitted to use it. She thanked him. On the third evening, he said nothing at all. On the fourth evening, he looked up from his papers midway through the first course and studied her for a moment with an expression she had begun to recognize, that quality of reluctant attention, of a man noticing something he had not budgeted for noticing. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. He seemed briefly to consider the etiquette of answering honestly. "Timidity," he said. "Gratitude of the excessive and inconvenient kind. Tears in the first week. I'm sorry to have disappointed you." "You haven't," he said, with a flatness that made it difficult to determine whether this was a compliment or simply a statement of administrative fact. He returned to his documents. Alara ate her soup and filed the exchange in the part of her mind she was keeping for him. A growing collection of observations about the man, arranged with the same care she gave to everything she could not yet fully interpret. He was not unkind. This was the first and most significant finding. She had prepared herself for unkindness, had armored against it with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to every potential difficulty, and she had found instead someone more complicated and less convenient than simple cruelty. He was cold in the way that some rooms were cold, not because heat had never been in them, but because something had extinguished it and left the absence in the shape of what had once been there. He moved through Ashford with a controlled efficiency that had the quality of a man keeping himself occupied on purpose. He rode early in the morning and was back before Lara came down for breakfast. He spent most of the day in his study with the door closed. He walked the grounds in the late afternoon with a purposefulness that was not quite pleasure, the walk of a man who has prescribed himself exercise rather than sought it. He did not entertain. No visitors came. No letters that produced visible response arrived. The house existed, it seemed, in a kind of deliberate suspension, maintained, correct, and motionless, like a watch wound carefully, and set to no particular hour. On the fourth night, Lara waited until the house was fully quiet. She had identified the entrance to the east wing on her second day, a door at the far end of the upper corridor, past the last of the regular bedroom doors, where the good carpet ended and the floorboards began. It was not locked. This surprised her, and then it did not. A wing that had been closed for years did not require a lock to keep people out. It required only the combined weight of habit, instruction, and the unspoken authority of a household that did not need to be told twice. Lara was not part of that household's long habit. She had received the instruction once in passing, when Mrs. Brant had given her a brief tour on the first afternoon. The east wing is not in use, and his lordship prefers it remain undisturbed. One sentence. The instruction of a household that considered it sufficient. It was not sufficient. She took the small oil lamp from her bedside table, turned low, barely more than a breath of flame, and she moved through the dark corridor in her stockings, the cold of the boards coming up through the wool, with each step, her free hand trailing the wall for orientation. The house breathed around her in its nighttime register. The settling of old timbers, the distant murmur of wind at some unsecured window, the periodic tick of a long case clock in the entrance hall, below marking time in the dark with the patient indifference of something that would still be counting long after everyone in the building was gone. She reached the east wing door and opened it. The air on the other side was different immediately. Cooler, stiller, the air of a space that was not regularly breathed in. It had a quality of preservation, not of neglect, the particular atmosphere of rooms closed not because they were forgotten, but because they were being deliberately set aside. She moved through into the wing's corridor, and her lamp threw its small amber circle ahead of her, illuminating dark wooden floors and closed doors on either side, and at the end of the corridor, the wider doorframe of something larger than a bedroom. She went toward it. The door was heavy, but moved smoothly on its hinges, well maintained, as everything in Ashford was well maintained, even the parts not meant to be visited. Beyond it was a room, long and wide, and running along the outer wall of the wing, its tall windows shuttered against the night. It smelled of linseed oil and old canvas, and the particular dry coolness of a room built to preserve something. She raised her lamp. She was in a gallery. The walls on both sides rose to the ceiling, and on them, in frames of varying ages and elaboration, hung paintings. She turned slowly, letting the lamplight travel, landscapes, a few still lives, but mostly portraits. Generations of portraits, arranged not in the formal dynastic sequence of the entrance hall, but in a denser, more private accumulation. The overflow of a family's self-documentation, stored here away from the main exhibition of the house. People who had not made it to the entrance hall, or had been removed from it. People kept here in the east wing's careful dark for reasons she did not yet know. She walked slowly along the left wall, holding the lamp to each face in turn. Men first, men she did not recognize, in the dress of preceding decades. Then women, a girl in white with ringlets, who looked faintly alarmed by the process of being painted, an elderly woman in black with a magnificent expression of settled authority, a young matron in the dress of perhaps the 1820s, holding a book with a slightly self-conscious air of someone who wished to convey intelligence. She turned to the right wall. She walked its length. And then she stopped. The painting was large, larger than the ones around it, and hung slightly apart from its neighbors, as though even in storage a small margin of consequence had been preserved around it. The frame was gilt, elaborate in the style of some years prior. The woman depicted was painted at 3/4 length, standing against the suggested background of what might have been these very grounds. Alara could see the shapes of familiar trees behind the painted figure, a suggestion of Ashford's west facade in the upper corner. But she did not look at the background. She looked at the woman. The breath went out of her with a quietness that was more unsettling than any sharp sound would have been. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 25 when she was painted. She wore a dress of dark blue silk, simply cut, and her dark auburn hair was arranged in the style of 20 years prior. Her posture was straight and easy at once, the posture of someone naturally composed rather than trained to performance. One hand rested at her side. The other was raised slightly, fingers loosely curled around nothing, as though she had been gesturing when the painter asked her to hold. Her face was Alara's face. Not identical, not the eerie precision of a mirror image, but something more unsettling than that. The correspondence of shared origin. The same architecture of bone beneath the skin, the same wide-set eyes, the same quality of the jaw, the particular way the upper lip curved. The woman was more beautiful, or had been rendered more beautifully, and there were differences that years and generation would account for. But the gray eyes were the same gray. The quality of attention in them, a watchfulness, an interior aliveness that the painter had caught with more accuracy than they might have intended, was the same quality Alara met in her own reflection every morning. She stood before the painting for a long time, the lamp burning low in her hand, her breath coming shallow. Then she looked at the small brass plate on the lower edge of the frame. She brought the lamp very close. The letters were fine and worn with age, but legible. Lady Cecilia Vane, 1821. Alara straightened up slowly. She looked at the face again, at the gray eyes, at the raised hand curved around its absent gesture, at the expression that was composed and watchful and entirely, unmistakably familiar. The name meant nothing to her. Not yet. She had no context for it, no framework on which to hang it. But the face was context enough for this moment, this cold, lamplit moment in the East Wing Gallery with the shuttered windows and the smell of linseed oil and the sound of her own blood moving in her ears. She was not looking at a stranger. She was looking at whoever she had come from. She pressed her fingers to the button beneath her dress, the enamel crest, the gold rim. She looked at the woman who had lived inside her bones without her knowing. She said nothing. There was no one to say anything to. But she made a promise in that gallery in the dark, as the lamp flame bent slightly in some current of air from the old shuttered windows. A promise to the painted woman and to herself, quiet and absolute as the house around her. She would find out who Cecilia Vane was. She would find out what had been done. And she would not leave Ashford Hall until she had every answer that had been taken from her before she was old enough to know they were being taken. The lamp burned. The gray eyes in the painting looked back at hers across 20 years of silence. And somewhere in the main wing of the house, a floorboard shifted, the particular creak of a specific board she had already catalogued, the one outside Lord Ashford's study on the upper floor. He was awake, moving. Alara turned from the portrait, raised her lamp, and moved quietly back through the gallery door, pulling it closed behind her without a sound. She was back in her blue room with the lamp extinguished before the footsteps reached the corridor's end. She lay in the dark with her eyes open. Lady Cecilia Vane, 1821. The name was the first stone in what she was beginning to understand would be a very long road. She was glad, she thought, pressing her hands flat against the warmth of the blanket, that she had always been good at walking. The library at Ashford Hall was the kind of room that made a person believe, briefly and completely, that the world outside it was optional. It occupied the full depth of the house on the ground floor's right side, running from the front windows that faced the entrance drive to the back windows that looked out over the kitchen garden and the bare November field beyond. 3 walls were books from floor to ceiling, not the decorative variety that wealthy households sometimes acquired by the yard for the appearance of cultivation, but real books, red books, books with cracked spines and marginal annotations, and the general dishevelment of volumes that had been lived with rather than displayed. The 4th wall held the fireplace, large and generous, and 2 deep armchairs positioned before it that had the quality of furniture, that has held the same human warmth, for so many years that warmth has become intrinsic to the material itself. Ilara spent every available hour in it. This was partly because the books were extraordinary. A range so comprehensive and unsystematic, it suggested generations of readers with wildly different preoccupations, which she found far more interesting than any curated collection would have been. But it was also because the library, she had discovered on her second day, shared a wall with Lord Ashford's study. And walls at Ashford, for all their thickness, were not entirely impermeable to the sounds of a man conducting his working life. She was not eavesdropping. Or rather, she was eavesdropping, but in the way that a person pressed for information makes use of every available resource, with purpose and without particular guilt. What she learned in those first 2 weeks was this: the estate was complicated. There were tenants in arrears and a disputed drainage agreement with a neighboring property, and something involving the terms of a late earl's that required the frequent involvement of a solicitor named Mr. Prentice, whose voice she heard through the wall twice. A thin, cautious voice, the voice of a man who spent his professional life navigating the space between what people wanted and what the law would allow, and had learned to inhabit that space with careful minimalism. She also learned that Lord Ashford was sharper than his cold economy of expression suggested. She heard him cut through a lengthy obfuscation from his estate manager in 3 sentences. She heard him identify, from the description alone, a flaw in a proposed tenant agreement that the estate manager had missed. He had the mind, she thought, of a man who had been educated to considerable effect, and then built additional floors on top of that education through sheer practice and a low tolerance for imprecision. She filed this alongside everything else she was keeping about him and continued reading her books. It was on the 15th day of her residence that things shifted. She had been in the library since shortly after breakfast, working her way through a volume on English inheritance law that she had found shelved between a natural history of the British Isles and a novel by Mrs. Radcliffe, the kind of proximity that she felt said something true about the nature of English domestic life. The inheritance law was dense and frequently circular, written in the way that legal texts were sometimes written, as though the author had decided that clarity would only encourage the wrong sort of reader. But it was navigable with patience, and she was following a particular thread about the conditions governing the inheritance rights of children born outside conventional marriage when the library door opened. She did not look up immediately. Mrs. Brant came in on most mornings to see that the fire was kept. The housemaid came mid-morning to dust. Ilara had learned the sound of each entrance and responded, or did not respond, accordingly. This entrance had a different weight, a different quality of silence following it. She looked up. Lord Ashford stood in the doorway with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the administrative neutrality of dinner, not the focused remove of a man passing through his own entrance hall, but something looser and more unguarded, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and found it unexpectedly occupied. He looked at her in the chair by the fire with the inheritance law volume, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then his eyes dropped to the book in her hands. He crossed the room. He was standing before her armchair now, close enough that she could see the detail of his waistcoat buttons, dark brass, stamped with a small geometric pattern, and the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was working toward a response he had not yet finished formulating. He held out one hand. She gave him the book. He looked at the spine. He looked at the page she had been reading. His expression underwent a series of small, rapid movements, calculation, assessment, something that might have been the precursor to suspicion, before settling into a stillness that she was learning to read as the face he wore while he decided how to respond to something unexpected. "Why are you reading this?" he asked. "It was on the shelf," she said. "There are 300 volumes on that shelf. You chose a text on inheritance law. I find the topic interesting. Do you?" It was not a question. His dark eyes were on her with an attention that was different from the cataloging look of their early acquaintance. Sharper, more present, the look of a man who has abruptly revised his estimate of a situation. "What specifically do you find interesting about it?" Ilara considered. She had prepared for this, had known that the book would require explanation if noticed, and had her explanation ready. But she found, looking up at him now, that she did not particularly want to use the prepared version. There was something in his directness that made deflection feel like a small dishonor. The conditions governing illegitimacy, she said. Specifically, the circumstances under which a child born outside marriage might nonetheless make a claim on a family's estate, given appropriate documentation. The silence that followed was longer than the ones before it. That is a very specific interest, he said finally. I am a very specific person, she replied. Something happened in his face then, something she would turn over many times afterward, trying to identify it precisely. It was not amusement, though it borrowed something from amusement. It was not warmth, though it edged toward warmth at its margins. It was the expression of a man encountering, for the first time in recent memory, something he had not predicted and found he could not immediately categorize, and who was discovering, to what appeared to be his own mild surprise, that he did not find this unpleasant. He set the book down on the small table beside her chair. He did not, as she had half expected, take it away. There is more current material on the topic, he said, in the right section of the third shelf on the south wall, published in the last decade, more relevant to current law. She looked at him. He looked back. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and moved to the desk on the far side of the room, where he apparently intended to work. She turned to look at the south wall and the third shelf. And then, because she was who she was, and she was doing what she was doing, she got up and found the books he had indicated. This became a pattern. Not an acknowledged pattern, nothing so formal as that, but a pattern nonetheless, the kind that accumulates through repetition without ever being named. He began to appear in the library in the mornings. He worked at the desk. She read in the chair. Occasionally he would say something, a correction, a recommendation, once a pointed observation about a passage she had read aloud unconsciously under her breath, which she had not realized she was doing until his voice came from across the room with the rest of the sentence she had been puzzling over. He had read everything in this library. She understood that gradually and found it, despite herself, remarkable. He began to ask her questions about what she was reading. Not the questions of a tutor testing comprehension, but the questions of a reader engaged with the text, the questions that said, I have an opinion about this, and I am interested in whether yours is the same or different, she answered. She offered her own questions in return. He answered those too, sometimes at length, forgetting in the absorption of the topic the policy of minimal engagement he otherwise maintained. She watched him in these moments, with the closest thing to fascination she had allowed herself since arriving at Ashford. He was different when his mind was fully engaged. The cold administrative surface gave way to something that moved more quickly and cared more deeply. And the quality of that caring was not what she had expected from a man who had selected a ward by pointing at the most dismissible girl in a room. He had opinions about justice, about the obligations of landowners to tenants, about the failures of institutions built to serve people who had subsequently decided to serve themselves instead. His opinions were not soft. They were not offered with any performance of feeling. But they were real, and they were his, and they were the opinions of someone who had looked at the world with real attention rather than inherited assumption. She found this, against all preparation and all better judgment, extraordinarily difficult to dismiss. There were other moments. Smaller ones, stranger ones. The morning she came downstairs and found him in the entrance hall with a small injured bird in his hands, a thrush that had struck one of the windows, holding it with a care entirely at odds with every other physical gesture she had observed from him, speaking to it in a low voice that he stopped the instant he heard her on the stairs, reverting in one fluid movement to his characteristic expression of neutral remove. The evening at dinner when she said something, a dry observation about the architectural ambitions of English country houses, that surprised a laugh from him. A real laugh, short and unguarded, lasting only a second before he recovered. He looked briefly alarmed by it, as though it had escaped some enclosure he was not aware he had been maintaining. The afternoon when passing through the entrance hall in the rain, he had noticed her looking up at the portraits on the staircase wall with the focused attention she usually reserved for legal texts, and he had stopped beside her, and without any preamble had said, *, my great-grandmother, my grandfather, his brother, his brother's wife, asterisk moving along the row with a finger that did not quite touch the frames, offering her the names and dates and brief characterizations of people she had no right to know, and was assembling, with each addition, into a picture she was only beginning to understand. She did not ask about Cecilia Vane. Not yet. The name sat in her like the button in her dress, carried close, held carefully, not yet spent. But she was watching him. She was watching him the way she watched everything she needed to understand, with patience, and with that quality of gray-eyed attention that saw more than it showed, that held more than it gave away. And she was aware, in the carefully maintained private interior of herself, of something she had not budgeted for. She was aware that she was beginning to watch him not only because she needed to, but because she wanted to. This was inconvenient. She noted it the way she noted most inconvenient things, with clarity, without panic, and with the intention of managing it through the application of sense and discipline. But she had also been noting, with the same careful honesty, that he was watching her, and that his watching had changed. It was no longer the inventory look of the orphanage, the brief administrative assessment of a man satisfying a legal requirement. It was something else now, something that did not have the shape of administration at all, that moved differently across her face and lingered in a way that administration did not linger. She did not name it. Naming things prematurely was its own variety of error. She simply held it, as she held all her careful gathered evidence, and continued her reading, and waited for the shape of everything to become clear enough to act on. Outside the library windows, November gave way to December. The first frost arrived, covering the grounds of Ashford in a white that was beautiful and briefly absolute, making the world clean and unwritten before the slow warming of each afternoon undid it. Alara watched the frost from the library window one morning while Lord Ashford worked at his desk behind her, and she thought about Lady Cecilia Vane with her gray eyes and her raised hand curved around its absent gesture, waiting in her gilt frame in the dark gallery. She thought about Mr. Prentice, the solicitor, and his thin, careful voice. She thought about the inheritance law books on the third shelf of the south wall. She was almost ready, she thought. Almost ready for the next step. She turned back to her book, and the fire burned, and the frost glittered on the lawn. And at the desk, Lord Dorian Ashford paused in his writing and looked at her for a moment with an expression that he almost certainly did not know was visible to the window glass. She saw it there, reflected faintly in the frostbright pane. She turned a page and said nothing, but something in her chest that she was managing with great discipline and considerable difficulty did something she had strictly instructed it not to do. It moved. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, that does not arrive with the elevated pulse and the dramatic resolution of a person who has decided to be brave. It arrives instead in the quiet of an ordinary morning, in the form of a decision made so calmly and completely that it feels less like courage and more like the inevitable next step in a sequence that was always going to lead here. Alara wrote the letter on a Tuesday. She had been planning it for 11 days. Composing and revising it in the privacy of her mind the way she composed most things, through a process of slow refinement that produced, eventually, something she trusted. She knew what she needed. She knew the risks of asking for it directly under her own name, a ward, a girl of no documented family, requesting estate files from a solicitor who served the household that contained her would be refused at best and reported at worst. She knew therefore that the letter could not come from Alara. It would need to come from Ashford. This was not, she told herself, precisely deception. It was the application of a necessary authority to a necessary inquiry. The distinction felt meaningful even if she understood it would not survive scrutiny. And she had enough honesty to know that its failure to survive scrutiny was precisely why she was not conducting it in full daylight. She waited until Lord Ashford rode out in the morning. She heard the horses from her window, the sound of hooves on the frost-hardened gravel fading southward toward the lower fields. She went to the library. She took from the desk drawer the writing paper she had observed him using. Cream stock, no crest, the kind of clean, anonymous page appropriate for estate business. She uncapped the ink, and she sat very straight, and she wrote. She kept it brief. Brevity in correspondence of this kind was not only more elegant, but more credible. A man like Ashford would not write 3 paragraphs, where 4 sentences would suffice, and she had been studying how he communicated for long enough to have absorbed the pattern of it. The letter requested from Mr. Prentice of Prentice and Holloway, solicitors, Gray's Inn Road, London, a full copy of the documents pertaining to the late Earl of Ashford's will, specifically those clauses addressing the provision for dependents and related parties beyond the direct line of succession, for his lordship's review in connection with the current estate management. She signed it with initials only, D.A. She folded it. She sealed it. She addressed it in her clearest hand and brought it downstairs to the entry table, where the outgoing correspondence waited for the afternoon post. She set it among the other letters. She walked back to the library and sat in the armchair and read 16 pages of a history of the English wool trade without retaining a single sentence. Then she went and had breakfast and behaved for the remainder of the day with complete and practiced normalcy. The response came in 8 days. 8 days in which she maintained her routine. Library in the mornings, the increasingly complicated business of meals with Lord Ashford, long walks in the grounds in the afternoons that were partly for the cold air and the use of her limbs, and partly to pass the time in a way that did not require her to sit still with her own anticipation. The frost had deepened as December settled in, and the grounds of Ashford in the early afternoon light were remarkable. The skeletal trees casting long blue shadows across the white lawn, the fountain's shallow basin now entirely frozen, the sky on the clear days a winter blue so cold and pure it seemed less like weather and more like statement. She walked and she thought and she waited. The letter from Prentice and Holloway arrived on a Wednesday, among the Morning Post, in an envelope of heavier paper than the others, with the firm's name printed across the flap in the precise, confident lettering of a legal practice that had been in business long enough to have opinions about fonts. Alara was in the library when the post was sorted. She had positioned herself, on the mornings when she expected it, near enough to the entrance hall to observe the process without appearing to observe it, a skill she had refined at St. Agatha's to considerable precision. She watched the housemaid carry the morning post to the study. She heard the study door open and close. She sat. 12 minutes later, she counted, because counting was better than the alternative. She heard the study door open again. She heard Lord Ashford's footsteps cross the entrance hall toward the dining room, which meant he was going to breakfast. She heard, from the brief pause before his footsteps continued, the particular sound of someone setting something down on the hall table as they passed. She emerged from the library into the entrance hall. The post was on the hall table. He had taken most of it to breakfast with him. He had left 3 envelopes, one that appeared to be a tradesman's account, one with the look of social correspondence he did not intend to engage with, and the envelope from Prentice and Holloway. He had left it. She stood looking at it for a moment. She understood why he had left it. He had not written to Prentice and Holloway. He would not recognize the letter as responding to a request of his, and he had likely set it aside as something to be examined later, a misfiling or an administrative anomaly he had not yet attended to. He was not suspicious. He was simply busy. She took the envelope. She went back to the library, closed the door, and opened it. There were 4 pages inside. She spread them across the desk and began to read, and she read with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything important, moving through the legal language with the patience she had developed across weeks of inheritance law texts, parsing the clauses and subclauses, and the long periodic sentences of a legal style that seemed to regard accessibility as a form of professional negligence. The first 2 pages were what she had expected and not what she was looking for. The standard provisions of the will, the entailment of the estate to Lord Ashford upon his father's death, the various bequests to staff and dependents, the endowment of the charitable provision that had required the taking of a ward. She turned to the 3rd page, and then she stopped. She went back to the beginning of the paragraph and read it again, slowly, then a 3rd time. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the fire and breathed. The paragraph in question concerned a supplementary provision, a clause added to the will in the final year of the late Earl's life, witnessed and notarized, its legal weight therefore fully established. It referenced, with the precise and emotionless language of legal documentation. An individual described as the natural child of Reginald Arthur Vane, younger brother of the late Earl, and of Cecilia Marie Vane née Hartley, his lawfully married wife. Alara's eyes moved over the words lawfully married wife, and something in her chest performed an action she had not authorized. The provision went on. The natural child, unnamed in this document, referred to throughout only as the aforementioned issue of the Vane Union, was accorded, by the specific terms of this supplementary clause, a contested interest in a portion of the Ashford estate known as the Vane Quarter, being the lands and properties originally settled on Reginald Vane upon his majority and never fully absorbed into the main estate through any documented legal process of reversion. The value of the Vane Quarter, expressed in the dry notation of an estate map reference and acreage count, was not elaborated. But Alara had read enough about the Ashford estate in the past weeks to understand that the Vane Quarter was not a small matter. It was the southeastern portion of the estate, farmland, a cottage holding, a stretch of river. Significant. Independently livable. The kind of provision that, properly established and legally pursued, would constitute not charity but inheritance. The child of Reginald and Cecilia Vane. Reginald Vane, who would have been the late Earl's younger brother, which made him Lord Ashford's uncle, who had, it now appeared, married a woman named Cecilia, who had, she checked the portrait, the date in her memory, painted his wife in 1821, who had, presumably, had a child who had been placed 3 years ago in St. Agatha's Orphanage in London, by arrangement, fee paid in full, no correspondence to be forwarded. She pressed her fingers flat against the pages. The button. The gray-gloved hands. This is not what I want for you. She was not the orphan of no one. She was the daughter of Reginald and Cecilia Vane. She was, by blood, the niece of the late Earl of Ashford. She was, by the terms of this supplementary clause, the heir to a portion of this estate. And she was sitting in the library of her own inheritance, having been brought here as an act of administrative charity by a man who did not know that the plain one he had pointed to in the corner of St. Agatha's Orphanage was the most consequential person in the room. She sat with this for a long time. The fire burned. Outside the window, the frost glittered on the garden. She thought about what it meant. All of it in sequence, the way she thought about everything, methodically, without letting the weight of it collapse the structure of her thinking. Her parents. She had had parents, she corrected, because the will's past tense, the careful of the late Reginald Vane, told her what she had suspected but not confirmed. They were gone. Both of them, or at least her father. The document did not specify her mother's fate. She held this fact carefully, the way you hold something that is both heavy and fragile, not letting yourself feel the full weight of it yet, because the full weight of it was not a thing she could afford right now. She thought about who had placed her in St. Agatha's. A woman in gray gloves who had wept. A governess? A family servant? Someone acting on instructions or acting against them. Someone who had loved her or simply managed her. She thought about why. Someone had wanted the child of Reginald and Cecilia Vane removed from consideration. Someone had understood, as Alara now understood, that the supplementary clause in the will created a claim, and that the claimant's existence was an obstacle to someone's interests. Someone had decided that an orphanage in London was the most efficient solution to the problem of that existence. Someone who would not be pleased to learn that the problem had ridden in a carriage to Ashford Hall and was currently sitting in the library reading their correspondence. She thought about Lord Ashford. He did not know. She was certain of this, or as certain as she could be, without more evidence, which was the most certainty she ever permitted herself about anything. If he had known, he would not have brought her here. He was not, she had concluded across weeks of careful observation, a man who maintained deceptions with ease or comfort. He was armored, yes. He was guarded and cold in his surface presentation. But he was not dishonest. There was a distinction she held between a man who concealed himself and a man who deceived others, and Dorian Ashford, she believed, was the former. He was also, by the terms of their current arrangement, the person who had legal custody of her. And he was going to have to be told. Not today. Not without more preparation, more verification, more understanding of who else knew what, and what the risks of disclosure were. She was not reckless, had never been reckless, had managed 3 years in an institution through the precise application of patience and strategic restraint. She would not abandon those qualities now, when they mattered most. She refolded the pages. She returned them to the envelope. She sat for a moment longer, pressing the envelope between her hands as though she could absorb more from it through the skin of her palms. Then she rose, crossed the desk, and replaced the envelope in its position. She had noted, before opening it, the exact angle at which it had been left, on the corner of the blotter. She would leave it where it could be found. Let him think it had been overlooked in the morning sorting. Let the discovery appear accidental. She went back to her chair. She opened her book, and she sat with the knowledge she had just acquired, the extraordinary, world-reconfiguring knowledge of who she was and what she was owed and what had been taken from her before she had words for the taking. And she held it inside the same stillness she had always carried, that deep well of composure that had been the only home she owned before she understood she was owed a real one. She was the daughter of Reginald and Cecilia Vane. She was no orphan. She had never been an orphan. She was a girl whose inheritance had been stolen by someone who had gambled on her remaining invisible forever. What that person had not accounted for was that invisibility, practiced long enough, becomes its own form of expertise, and that the invisible girl in the corner had spent 3 years becoming very, very good at finding what was hidden. She turned a page. She was just getting started. The thing about a carefully constructed silence is that it has a sound, a specific, pressurized quality that a person of sufficient attentiveness can hear, the way you can hear a held breath in a quiet room without seeing the person holding it. Alara had been living inside her silence for 6 days since reading the solicitor's documents. 6 days of breakfast and library and dinner and the frost-bright afternoons. 6 days of sitting across from Lord Ashford at that long dining table with the knowledge of who she was pressed beneath her ribs like the button beneath her dress. And she had managed it. She had managed it with the same practiced composure she brought to everything. And she had almost convinced herself that she would continue managing it until she had developed a complete and unassailable plan for what came next. Then he found the letter. She was not in the library when it happened. She had gone upstairs to her blue room for her afternoon reading, a concession to the cold, which had deepened in the past week to a degree that even the library fire could not fully contest. She heard it not as a sound, but as a change in the quality of the house's silence, a shift in the atmosphere below that was not quite noise, but was not quite the ordinary stillness of an Ashford afternoon either. Something in the house's specific silence that told her its balance had been disturbed. She put down her book. She listened. Footsteps. Purposeful ones. Not the measured, controlled steps of a man moving through his own house in his ordinary way, but something with more energy in it. Something covering ground. She heard the library door open. A pause. The library door close. Then footsteps again toward the staircase. She was already sitting very straight when the knock at her door came. 3 knocks. Firm. Not aggressive, but with the precision of a man who wants to be heard and is controlling how much else he communicates. "Come in," she said. He entered. He was still in his riding coat. He had been out that afternoon, and had clearly come straight here rather than changing, which told her a great deal about the state of his composure before she looked at his face. He held the envelope from Prentice and Holloway in one hand, and his expression was the expression of a man who has encountered something that has significantly rearranged his understanding of his own circumstances and is in the immediate, unfinished process of deciding what to do with the rearrangement. He was not, she noted with relief that she did not permit herself to show, angry. Or rather, the anger that was there was not directed at her. Not yet, not cleanly. It was the generalized, unsettled energy of a man who has been surprised by something and is too honest not to show it, even when he would clearly prefer to show nothing at all. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I received a letter," he said, "from my solicitor, in response to a request I did not make." A pause. "I see," she said. "The letter was opened." "Yes." Something tightened in his jaw, not anger, she thought, but the physical manifestation of a man processing a sequence of implications rapidly and not finding the processing comfortable. "You wrote to my solicitor," he said, "using my name." "Your initials," she said, "and I am sorry for it. I want to say that first and mean it genuinely, not as a preface to justification, but as a thing I'm saying on its own. What I did was a deception, and it was a deception I chose with full understanding of what it was." He was quiet for a moment. He came further into the room, not dramatically, not in the manner of a man making a point of advancing, but simply because standing in the doorway of someone's room while conducting this kind of conversation was an awkward theater that he appeared to find as unsuitable as she did. He stopped near the window, the winter light behind him, and looked at her with an attention that was more complex than anything she had yet received from him. "What did you find?" he asked. And here was the moment. Here was the thing she had been building toward across 6 days of carried silence and 6 weeks of careful accumulation. The moment of telling him, of releasing the held breath, of stepping from the careful privacy of her own knowledge into the exposure of sharing it. She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed, in the way she rehearsed everything important, the architecture of the disclosure, what to say first, how to sequence the revelations, how to present the evidence with enough clarity that he could follow the logic rather than reacting to the shock. She had planned to be measured, controlled. She had planned to present it as a case, as she might present findings to a reasonable mind open to considering them. What she had not planned for was the way he was looking at her. Not with the administrative assessment of their early acquaintance. Not with the reluctant, surprised warmth of their library mornings. With something that had all the guard removed from it. The particular openness of a man caught in the moment before he has rebuilt his expression, looking at her as though she were something that mattered to the outcome of what was about to be said. She told him. She told him all of it, not in the careful sequenced presentation she had planned, but in the order it had happened. The order of her own discovery, the portrait, the brass plate, the name, the solicitor's documents, the supplementary clause, the words lawfully married wife that had undone every assumption about her origin, the vain quarter, the inheritance, what it meant logically and legally if the documents could be verified and the connection established. She told him about the button. She reached through the fabric of her dress and produced it, 3 years of hiding it, and now she set it in her palm and held it out toward him, the deep blue enamel, the gold rim, the crest she had carried without being able to identify. He crossed the room and looked at it. His face changed. It changed in the way of a man who has just received a blow he did not see coming, not collapsing, not dramatic, but the specific internal rearrangement that is visible only in the eyes and in the slight arrested quality of the breath. He looked at the button for a long moment. His hand came up and he took it from her palm, carefully, with 2 fingers, as though it were something that required care. And he turned it over. "This is the vain crest," he said. His voice was very quiet. "My Uncle Reginald's crest. He had his wife's things commissioned with it when they married. She wore it on everything. He was very proud of her, I'm told. I was a child when they both died." He looked up from the button to her face. "Both," she said. "Within a year of each other. My uncle died of a fever in the autumn of 1835. His wife, Cecilia, died the following spring." He stopped. "They told me there was no child. My father told me there was no child." The words landed between them in the cold winter air of the blue room with the weight of something that had been falling for a long time and had finally reached the floor. "Your father was wrong," Ilara said. "Or your father was told incorrectly. Or my father was lied to," Dorian said. He set the button down on the windowsill very carefully. "Or my father lied." This last possibility he produced with the specific effort of a man who loves the person he is accusing and is being honest in spite of that love, which is a harder kind of honest than most. Ilara watched his face and felt, beneath her own composure, something she had not expected. A sorrow for him. Not pity. She had too much respect for him for pity. But sorrow, clean and genuine, for the man standing at her window, holding the discovery that his family had built something over a lie, and he was only now seeing the foundation. "I don't think your father was the architect of it," she said. The will's supplementary clause. He added it himself. He acknowledged, at the end of his life, that the child of Reginald and Cecilia had a claim. He built it into the document. He was trying to correct something. Dorian was quiet, looking at the crest on the button. But he didn't name you, he said. He didn't name the child. He left it as a general provision, which means it can be claimed but not confirmed without additional documentation, she said. Which means whoever wanted the claim suppressed didn't need to destroy the will. They only needed to suppress the child, to ensure that the child never arrived at a position from which she could make the claim. He turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that had moved through several places and arrived at a stillness that was more intense than anything she had yet seen from him. Someone placed you in that orphanage deliberately, he said. Yes. Someone who knew about the supplementary clause. Someone who understood that your existence, the existence and identification of Reginald and Cecilia's child, represented a legal and financial threat to their interests. Yes, she said. And then he stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man completing a calculation he would have preferred not to reach the end of. And then I arrived at the orphanage, acting on the terms of my father's will. The charitable provision. The charitable provision that required the taking of a ward, she said quietly, of appropriate age. From St. Agatha's, specifically, was the institution specified in the will. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Yes, St. Agatha's, specifically. Your father named the institution, she said, as though he knew that was where I would be. The silence between them had a new quality, now, not the comfortable silences of a library, not the neutral silences of the dinner table. This was the silence of two people standing at the edge of an understanding that was changing the shape of everything they could see, watching it change in real time with a somewhat vertiginous feeling of ground that had seemed solid, performing, quietly and irreversibly, the act of becoming otherwise. He brought me here, Elara said, in the only way he could, without naming me directly, without tipping his hand to whoever had done this. He wrote a provision that made the bringing of a ward from St. Agatha's a legal requirement, and he trusted that the girl placed there would eventually find her way to what was hers, Dorian finished. His voice on those last words was strange, lower, rougher at the edges. The voice of a man feeling something he was not accustomed to feeling and hadn't quite the surface for. He walked to the armchair in the corner of the room and sat down in it, not his usual controlled lowering of himself into furniture, but the slightly unguarded motion of a man who has discovered that standing is requiring more management than he currently has available. He pressed the heels of his hands briefly against his eyes. The East Wing, he said. You went to the East Wing. It was not a question. He had removed his hands and was looking at her with an expression that held something unexpected in it. Not accusation, not even reproach, but something that looked oddly like relief. As though the revelation of what she had done was, perversely, a more comfortable thing than the mystery of who she would have been. Yes, she said. The portrait. Yes. When? The fourth night. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the button on the windowsill. I moved that portrait myself, he said. When I inherited, it had been in the entrance hall. I was told she was no one significant, that it was a distant connection of my mother's that tradition had kept on the wall past its relevance. I moved it to the gallery because something about it, he stopped. I couldn't say why. It seemed important to keep it, and I couldn't say why I didn't want it where I could see it every day. He looked up at Elara. Because it looks like you, he said. I couldn't have articulated that then. I hadn't met you, but something in the painting had been unresolved. And now, she said. The fire crackled. The winter light was fading from the window behind him, the pale afternoon darkening toward the early evening that December produced with such brisk efficiency. Someone in this web, Elara said, bringing them back, gently, but back, to what had to be faced, is still alive, still active. The governess who placed me, or whoever instructed her, whoever benefits from my being unidentified. She paused. Lord Ashford, who stands to lose the most if the vain quarter claim is successfully made. He was very still. He already knew the answer. She could see that he knew it, could see the specific quality of a man looking at a truth he has been standing next to for years without fully turning to face it. My father had a brother, he said slowly. Reginald was his younger brother, but he had an older brother as well. He stopped. Yes, Ilara said. My uncle, he said. Lord Hargrove. He has been the estate's senior advisor since my father's death. He paused. He would have been the one to manage matters when Reginald and Cecilia died. He would have had access to everything, the properties, the documents, the knowledge of what Reginald and Cecilia left behind. Including a child, Ilara said. Including a child, he said. The name hung in the room between them, Lord Hargrove, unspoken but present, the way certain names are present once thought, taking up air, rearranging everything. Dorian Ashford looked at the girl who was his cousin, the girl he had chosen for her plainness, for her dismissibility, for her convenient invisibility, and his face held an expression that Ilara did not have a name for yet, something that occupied the space between fury and something much softer and much more complicated than fury. He reached out and picked up the button from the windowsill. He held it for a moment, the enamel crest of his uncle Reginald, the gold rim that his cousin had carried against her skin for 3 years. Then he held it out to her. This belongs to you, he said. She took it. Their fingers did not quite touch in the exchange, but the distance between them was small enough to notice. Small enough that the not touching had its own quality, its own register, something she felt across the small cold air of the gap, with a precision that had nothing to do with inheritance law and everything to do with the part of herself she was managing with great difficulty and diminishing success. We need to be careful, she said. Hargrove cannot know what we know. Not yet. Agreed, he said. Immediately and completely. No hesitation, no qualification. We had passed between them, without comment, and been absorbed into the conversation, as though it had always been the operative pronoun, and neither of them noted it, and both of them felt it. I need more documentation, she said. A birth record. A marriage certificate for my parents. Something that names me specifically as their child. I know where to look, he said. She looked at him. My father's private papers, he said. In the study. I have not gone through all of them. There are boxes I haven't opened. He paused. I have been avoiding certain things. He rose from the armchair. He looked at her across the room in the winter dark light, and the look was nothing like any look she had received from him in all the weeks she had been here. Not the administrative assessment, not the reluctant warmth, not the surprised opening she had caught in window glass. This look was direct and unguarded and looked at her as though she were fully present, fully real, fully there in the blue room of her own inheritance with her gray eyes and her 3-year-old button and her extraordinary, unextinguishable refusal to remain the girl in the corner. Come to the study tomorrow morning, he said. We'll go through them together. She nodded. He moved toward the door. Lord Ashford, she said. He turned. I am sorry, she said again, for the letter, for using your name. I am not sorry for what it produced, but I am sorry for the method. He looked at her for a long moment. The method, he said carefully, was what I would have done. He left. Ilara sat in the blue room in the settling dark and held the button in her closed hand, feeling the warmth her fingers had put into it, and felt everything she was managing press against its management with a force she was increasingly uncertain could be maintained. Tomorrow the study. Together. The word had passed so naturally between them, as though it had always been true, as though it was only now being said aloud. The study at Ashford Hall was a room that had clearly been shaped by more than one man's occupancy, a palimpsest of 2 generations of Ashford lords, the older layer visible in the heavy mahogany furniture and the faded hunting prints on the far wall, the newer layer in the organized precision of the desk surface and the bookshelves arranged with a system that was Dorian's own, functional and unsentimental, and entirely characteristic of its creator. Ilara arrived at 8:30 in the morning to find him already there. He had pushed aside the usual debris of estate business and pulled from a corner of the room 3 large document boxes, the kind of deep, lidded affairs that solicitors and secretaries used for the archiving of papers, too important to discard and too sensitive to display. They sat on the cleared desk surface like a small, forbidding city, their lids dusty with the particular dust of things that had not been approached for some years. He looked up when she entered. He had dressed with his usual precision, dark coat, white cravat, but there was something different in his bearing this morning, something that had been present since their conversation the previous evening and had not quite retreated in the interval. A quality of purposeful openness, the bearing of a man who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. "I found these in the back of the lower cabinet," he said, by way of greeting. "They were my father's. I had my own solicitor go through the financial documents when I inherited, but these," he paused, looking at them with an expression that balanced resolution against something more reluctant. "These are personal. Letters, journals, private correspondence. I had not felt the occasion to open them." "But now the occasion has arrived," Ilara said. With some insistence, he agreed, and there was the ghost of that almost laugh in it, that brief, unguarded thing that she had started to anticipate and was careful not to show that she anticipated. They sat across from each other at the desk, one box each, the third set between them, and they began. It was slow, meticulous work, the work of moving through a dead man's private archive with the dual purpose of finding something specific and not missing anything else. The late Earl's handwriting was large and somewhat erratic, the handwriting of a man more comfortable with action than correspondence, and his filing system appeared to have been organized along principles so personal as to be essentially cryptic to anyone who had not inhabited his particular mind. Letters were mingled with receipts, estate notes with what appeared to be fragments of journals, invitations to events decades past pressed between documents of genuine consequence, without apparent distinction. Dorian worked through his box with a focused quiet that she had come to recognize as his thinking expression, the expression that meant his mind was moving rapidly behind the still surface, processing and sorting and connecting. She worked through hers with the same methodical patience she brought to everything important, reading each document fully before setting it aside, cross-referencing names and dates against what she already knew. An hour passed. The fire burned steadily. Outside, the frost-white grounds were beginning their mid-morning thaw, the sun for once making its presence felt in the pale December sky. She found the first relevant document in this second hour. It was a letter, folded and refolded enough times to suggest it had been carried, consulted, returned to, the letter of a man who had been living with something difficult. Dated the 12th of March, 1836, addressed in the late Earl's hand and signed with a name that made her sit very straight. "Your brother, Arthur." She read it quickly. Then, again, more slowly. "Lord Ashford," she said. He looked up. She passed the letter across the desk. He read it. His face, as he read, did the thing she had observed it doing when he was processing something that mattered. The small, controlled movements beneath the surface stillness, the physiological evidence of a mind fully engaged with something it would have preferred not to need to engage with. The letter was from the late Earl to his older brother, to Lord Hargrove, and it had in all probability never been sent. It was a draft or a final version set aside in a moment of changed intention. In it, the late Earl expressed, with the careful restraint of a man who loved his brother and was none the less confronting him, his knowledge that Reginald and Cecilia's child had not died with her parents as reported. He had received, the letter stated, information from a reliable party, unnamed, but described as someone present at the time, that an infant had survived and been placed, by arrangement, in the care of a private household before subsequently. The phrasing here was careful, almost encoded, being transferred to an institutional arrangement in the city. He knew. The late Earl had known. He had known, and he had been afraid. The letter made this visible in the spaces between its careful sentences, in the things it approached and did not quite say, afraid of what confronting his older brother openly would cost him, what it would unmake. He had loved his brother. He had also known what his brother had done, and so he had done what he could within the constraints of what he was willing to risk. He had built the supplementary clause into his will. He had specified St. Agatha's, because by then he knew, or had deduced, where the child had been placed. He had created a mechanism, careful and indirect, that might someday bring her home without requiring him to fight the battle he was not brave enough to fight directly. He had tried. In his incomplete, compromised, loving and insufficient way, he had tried. Dorian set the letter down. He was silent for a long moment. He was looking at the letter the way a person looks at something that has just fundamentally revised a relationship they will never be able to have again. The relationship with a father who is dead and can no longer be asked to explain himself. He knew, Dorian said. His voice was even. The evenness of it was, she understood, an act of considerable will. He knew, she confirmed. And he said nothing. To anyone. For years. He said something, she said carefully. He said it in the only way he felt he safely could. Dorian looked at her across the desk, and his dark eyes held a complexity that she felt without being able to fully name. Gratitude for the gentleness of this, perhaps, and something else beneath it. Something that the gentleness itself had reached. Hargrove, he said. Keep reading, she said. They kept reading. The second discovery came 40 minutes later, in the third box, buried beneath a layer of estate correspondence from the 1830s. Correspondence that Alara moved through quickly before stopping at a document that was not a letter, but a receipt. A receipt from St. Agatha's Orphanage, dated the 17th of September, 1839, for a placement fee paid in full by a party recorded only as. And here the clerk's handwriting had the careful imprecision of someone who had been paid not to be too precise, an agent acting on behalf of a private family concern. The amount was substantial. More than substantial. The amount of money that did not arrange discretion incidentally, but purchased it specifically. She was looking at the record of her own placement. She turned it over. On the back, in handwriting she now recognized from other documents in the box, the late Earl's large, erratic hand, a single line, written sometime after the receipt was filed, pressed into the paper with a weight that suggested force applied in the grip of strong feeling. *H arranged it. God forgive me for my silence. *H. Hargrove. She passed it to Dorian without a word. She watched him read it, watched the line of his jaw set in a way she had not seen before, not the controlled tightness of managed feeling, but something harder and less managed. The expression of a man discovering that his trust has been occupied, for years, by someone who had no right to it. He set the receipt down. He was very still. He has been in this house, Dorian said. His voice had dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than his ordinary speaking register, a quality that reminded her sharply that beneath the cold precision of his manner was a man of considerable force who had simply chosen, thus far in their acquaintance, to keep it leashed. He has sat at my table. He has advised me on the management of the estate. He has, for years he has. He stopped. He is coming this week, he said. Alara went still. What? He wrote last month. He visits twice yearly. It is a standing arrangement since my father's death. He arrives Thursday. Dorian's eyes moved to her with an alertness that had resolved, in the course of the morning, into something so direct it was almost a physical sensation. He doesn't know what we found. He cannot know, she said immediately. Not yet. Not until we have everything, every document, every piece of evidence. If he arrives and suspects that we know, he will move to protect himself, and we will lose the advantage. Agreed. The word came quickly, completely. The same quality of immediate alliance she had felt from him the evening before. It struck her again, this quality. The way he had simply and entirely stepped to her side of this, without negotiation, without condition. She had expected, at some stage of this revelation, some resistance, some retreat to self-interest, some pulling back toward the comfortable established order that kept his world intact. She had prepared for it. She had rehearsed privately for the possibility that he would hear what she had to say and find the disruption too significant to fully absorb. He had done none of that. He had simply looked at what was true and chosen it. We have 2 days, he said. I want to go through the rest of these documents before Thursday. If there is a birth record, a marriage certificate, anything that confirms your parentage specifically. There is somewhere else to look, Alara said. She had been turning this over since the previous evening. The East Wing, the gallery. The portrait of Cecilia was there, but a gallery of that kind, a private storage of family documents and artifacts. She paused. There may be other things there. Things Hargrove would have overlooked or not known to look for. Dorian looked at her. You've been thorough, he said. The observation held something in it, not quite admiration, and yet it occupied the same region of tone. "I've been thorough," she agreed, without false modesty. They went to the East Wing that afternoon, together this time in the full and unremarkable light of a December afternoon, with no need for stocking feet or turn-down lamps. The gallery looked different in daylight. Larger, somehow, the canvases more vivid, the dust motes moving through the pale shafts of light that came around the edges of the shutters with the slow, suspended grace of things that have been undisturbed for a long time. He opened the shutters. Light fell across Cecilia's portrait. They stood before it together, and the silence between them in that moment was unlike any previous silence. Not the comfortable silences of the library, not the charged silences of the study, not the careful managed distances of the dinner table. This silence had the quality of something witnessed, of two people standing at the intersection of a story they had each, without knowing it, been living from different sides. "She was beautiful," he said quietly. He was looking at the portrait. I was very small when she died. I don't have a memory of her." "She looks like someone who thought a great deal," Elara said. "She looks like you," he said. He said it simply, without adornment, without appearing to consider whether it was the kind of thing he ought to say. He simply said what was true, in the way she had come to understand was his essential mode when his guard came fully down, direct and undecorated. The language of a man who had no use for embellishment when the fact itself was sufficient. She looked at Cecilia's gray eyes. "Yes," she said. They found what they needed in the East Wing's adjoining room. A smaller space beyond the gallery that had the feeling of a private sitting room, its furniture sheeted in white cloth, its surfaces cleared, but its cabinets intact. The cabinet along the inner wall was locked, but Dorian found the key on the ring that hung with the estate keys in his study, fourth from a left, labeled in the late Earl's handwriting with a single letter. R. Reginald. Inside the cabinet, wrapped in oilskin against the damp, tied with ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to a pale suggestion of the color, was a collection of documents. A marriage certificate. Reginald Arthur Vane to Cecilia Marie Hartley. Dated the 4th of June, 1819. Witnessed and registered. Letters between them, dozens, bundled separately. The correspondence of a long and evidently devoted attachment. She did not read these. They were private in a way that the legal documents were not, and she had too much respect for the people they concerned. And at the back of the cabinet, in a separate envelope sealed with wax that had long since dried and cracked, a document that made Elara's hands, for the first time in this entire investigation, not entirely steady. A birth record. She was named. She was named and dated, and described as the lawful daughter of Reginald Arthur Vane and Cecilia Marie Vane née Hartley. Born the 3rd of March, 1825, at Ashford Hall's East Wing Chambers. She had been born here. She had been born in this house. Dorian took the document from her hands, not taking it away from her, but supporting it, because her hands were doing the thing she had spent considerable effort preventing them from doing. And she let him take the edge of the paper because the alternative was to manage alone what she was currently finding unmanageable. He read the birth record. He looked at her name on it. Elara Cecilia Vane. "Your mother named you for herself," he said, very quietly. Elara looked at her mother's name in her own. She had always had it, had carried it without knowing what it meant, without knowing it was a thread tied from one woman to another across the years of silence and erasure. She had not cried in front of another person since she was old enough to understand that crying in front of people gave them information she preferred to withhold. She did not cry now, but something in her face apparently communicated enough of what was happening beneath its surface, because Dorian set the document carefully down on the cabinet surface and turned toward her and said nothing, simply said nothing, which was, she was discovering one of the things he was best at, and the quality of his nothing, his nearby, present nothing, was something she felt across the small cold air of the East Wing room with a specificity that had nothing to do with legal documentation, and everything to do with the fact that she was not, for the first time in recent memory, managing what she felt entirely alone. She breathed. She steadied. She picked up the birth record. "We have everything," she said. Her voice was clear. She was very proud of how clear it was. "We have everything," he agreed. "Thursday," she said. "Hargrove comes Thursday." "Yes." She looked at the documents in her hands, the marriage certificate, the birth record, the receipt with its damning inscription on the back, the accumulated evidence of a life stolen and an identity suppressed. "I want to be in the room," she said. "When you confront him, she paused, selecting the honest word. "I want him to see me." Dorian looked at her for a long, considered moment. "You will be in the room," he said, with a certainty that required no further architecture. No conditions, no qualifications, no gentle suggestions that it might be better managed differently. Simply, "You will be in the room." She nodded. They gathered the documents carefully, reverently, returning them to their oilskin wrapping with the attention due to things that had waited a long time in the dark to matter. They carried them from the east wing into the main house, and as they passed through the connecting door, Alara paused and looked back at the gallery, at Cecilia's portrait, at the gray eyes in the afternoon light coming now fully through the open shutters. She thought, "I know who I am. I know who you were. I am coming, *." She turned back to the main house, walked forward through the door, and let Dorian close it behind them both. Thursday was 2 days away. Let Hargrove come. Lord Hargrove arrived on Thursday at 2:30 in the afternoon, which was, Alara had been told, precisely when he always arrived. A man who considered punctuality a form of authority and exercised it with the consistency of someone who understood that small reliabilities built large impressions over time. She watched him from the upper corridor window. He descended from his carriage with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in the landscape he was entering. Not the ease of a guest, but the ease of someone who considered himself a permanent feature of a place regardless of whose name was on the deed. He was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with the remnants of what had once been a physically commanding presence, now softened at its edges by age and the particular comfortable thickening of a man who had eaten well for decades. His hair was silver, worn short. His face was ruddy and well-constructed. The face of a man who had learned, across a long life of strategic social navigation, to arrange his features into an expression of affable authority that was, Alara suspected, as cultivated and as fundamentally dishonest as everything else about him. He looked up at the house as he walked toward the door. His gaze moved across the facade with the proprietary sweep of a man taking inventory of something he considers his own by a logic that supersedes legal technicality. Alara stepped back from the window before his gaze reached the upper floor. She had dressed carefully that morning, not elaborately. She had neither the wardrobe nor the inclination for elaborate, but with the specific intention of being entirely herself. The dark green dress that Mrs. Brant had procured for her in the second week, which fit well and had the quality of a garment that did not apologize for the person wearing it. Her hair down, not loose, but in the style she had settled into at Ashford, a simple arrangement that required neither performance nor concealment. No jewelry except the button, which she had threaded overnight onto a length of narrow ribbon and now wore at her collar. The vain crest visible, small and blue and gold, against the dark green of her dress. She had thought carefully about the button, about the decision to wear it where it could be seen. It was a deliberate act, and she was entirely clear about its deliberateness. It was a flag planted, a statement made in the language of objects rather than words, and it was designed to be seen by exactly one person and to communicate to that person, before a single word was spoken, that the game he had been playing for 20 years was over. She descended the stairs at 3 o'clock, which was when Dorian had arranged for tea to be served in the main drawing room, a civilized theater for what was not going to be a civilized conversation. She heard Hargrove's voice as she reached the lower corridor. A large voice, deployed with the expansive confidence of a man who had never been made to manage his volume in any room, rolling through the drawing room door with the authority of a person who considered the space his natural habitat. The Eastern drainage question, which I think can be managed quite satisfactorily with a reasonable approach to Pemberton. He's an amenable enough fellow when properly handled. And of course the London business. I have some thoughts on the investment question your man raised last month, though I must say I think Whitmore has been rather more conservative than the situation warrants. She opened the drawing room door. The voice stopped, not gradually, not in the natural tapering of a sentence finding its end, but with the abrupt quality of a mechanism interrupted mid-operation. Alara marked this, the specific quality of the stop, the fraction of a second before the recovery, and filed it beside everything else she was keeping. Hargrove was standing by the fireplace with a cup of tea he had apparently already acquired, in the manner of a man so at home in this house that he had helped himself before the offer was made. Dorian stood at the window, positioned, she noted, exactly where she had expected him to position himself, which was with the light behind him and a clear sight line to both the door and the room's other occupant. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes did the brief, focused thing they had started doing when she entered rooms, a thing she was no longer pretending, in the privacy of her own assessment, not to notice. "Ah," Hargrove said. One syllable. She listened to it carefully. Ah, not the ah of a man encountering something unexpected, but the ah of a man encountering something he had not expected to encounter here, in this particular configuration, with this particular quality of deliberateness surrounding its presentation. There was a micro-adjustment in his expression, so brief and so controlled that a less attentive observer would have missed it entirely, before the affable authority reassembled itself across his features with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "The ward," he said pleasantly. "Dorian told me in his last letter that he had fulfilled the provision. I had not yet had the pleasure." He said ward with the precise weight of a man using the word as both description and reminder, reminding the room and himself of the category in which she had been placed. The word was a small fence, erected with great casualness. Alara observed this with a calm that she felt, for once, not as performance, but as something genuine, the calm of a person who knows exactly where they stand and no longer requires anyone else to confirm it. "Lord Hargrove," she said pleasantly. She crossed to the armchair that placed her neither behind Dorian nor in front of him, but beside him, a positioning she had decided on in advance, having thought at some length about the geometry of what was about to happen. She sat. She arranged herself with the particular ease of a person entirely comfortable in the space she was occupying. Hargrove's eyes moved to her collar. She watched them find the button. She watched what happened in the half-second that followed. It was very small. It was, to his considerable credit as a man who had been managing this particular concealment for 20 years, almost nothing. A barely perceptible stillness in the hand holding the teacup. A fractional constriction around the eyes. A quality in his breathing that changed and then immediately corrected. Almost nothing. But Alara was watching with the focused attention of someone who had been reading the unspoken communications of people in difficult situations, since she was old enough to understand that the spoken ones were the least reliable part of any conversation. She saw it. She catalogued it. She felt it confirm, with a cold and clarifying precision, everything she had already known. He recognized the crest. Of course he did. "I was just telling your guardian," Hargrove said, recovering his large, affable voice with impressive speed and returning it to Dorian, "about the Pemberton drainage situation. Tedious business, but it does want attending to before the spring thaw." "We can address the Pemberton matter another time," Dorian said. His voice was quiet. It was the specific quiet of a man who is not raising it because he does not need to, the quiet of someone who has decided the room is his and is not making an argument of it, merely stating a fact. Hargrove paused. The briefest beat of recalibration. "Of course," he said easily. "Is there something more pressing?" "Yes," Dorian said. He moved from the window to the desk at the side of the room, the small writing desk that held, beneath its surface in the locked drawer, the documents they had spent the past 2 days carefully organizing, considering, and preparing for exactly this moment. He produced the key from his waistcoat pocket and opened the drawer. He set the oilskin-wrapped bundle on the desk surface. He did not open it immediately. He looked at his uncle. "I have been going through my father's papers," he said. There were 3 boxes I had not previously examined. Personal correspondence, private records. He paused. It has been instructive reading. Hargrove's expression underwent another of those micro-adjustments, this one slightly less controlled than the first, the fraction of a second before the recovery slightly longer. He set his teacup down on the mantelpiece. "I imagine so," he said. "Your father was a thorough man. Though I'd caution against reading too much weight into private correspondence. Men write things in private that reflect their moods of the moment rather than the settled." He wrote that you arranged it, Dorian said. The room became very still. I beg your pardon? Hargrove said. His voice was even. The evenness of it was also a performance, and not a perfect one. There was a quality beneath it that had changed, a tension that had entered the architecture of his manner and was not entirely containable. The placement, Dorian said, of the child, of Reginald and Cecilia's daughter. He looked at his uncle with an expression that Alara had not seen from him before, not cold, not angry, but something more final than either. The expression of a man who has loved someone and has been handed, along with the evidence of their betrayal, the simultaneous obligation to confront it without flinching. He wrote, God forgive me for my silence. And he named you. H arranged it. You arranged it. Hargrove was silent for 3 full seconds. Alara counted them. Then the strategy shifted. She saw it happen. Saw the recalibration of a man who has spent a long life in difficult negotiations and knows that the position of innocent confusion, once untenable, must be abandoned in favor of the next available line of defense. Your father, Hargrove said carefully, was a man in declining health in the last year of his life, and he was... Don't, Dorian said. Just that. One word, quiet as everything else, but with a finality in it that stopped Hargrove's sentence cleanly. We have the marriage certificate, Dorian said. Reginald and Cecilia Vane, 1819, witnessed and registered. We have the birth record. He paused, and his eyes moved briefly to Alara, not a glance of confirmation, but of acknowledgement, the look of a man sharing something rather than reporting it. Alara Cecilia Vane, born 3rd of March, 1825, at Ashford Hall. We have the placement receipt from St. Agatha's, bearing the notation of a private family arrangement. And we have the supplementary clause of my father's will, which grants the Vane quarter to the lawful issue of Reginald and Cecilia Vane. He opened the oilskin. He laid the documents on the desk surface in a row. He did not present them with drama. He did not gesture at them or invite examination. He simply laid them out in the matter-of-fact manner of a man who has sufficient evidence that theatrics would be redundant. Hargrove looked at the documents. He looked at Alara, and she saw it, saw the thing that he had been managing from the moment she walked through the door, finally exhaust its management. Not guilt. She had not expected guilt from a man of this construction. Guilt required a capacity for remorse that people who did what this man had done rarely maintained at any useful level. But she saw something else. The specific expression of a man who has played a long game with great skill and is standing in the moment of its failure, in the compound revelation that the pieces have been found and assembled and laid against him, and that the player across from him is not who he expected. He had expected, she thought, a frightened girl in an orphanage dress. He had expected, perhaps, an inconvenient document and an uncertain legal question he could bury in the slow machinery of professional obfuscation. He had not expected her. He had certainly not expected Dorian. The strategy shifted again. She watched it shift with the analytical detachment of someone who had been expecting it and had prepared for exactly what came next. Even if I were to accept the characterization your father's private notation implies, Hargrove said, his voice finding a new register, careful, measured, the register of a man pivoting to professional terrain where he felt more secure. The legal question of this young woman's claim is far from straightforward. The supplementary clause is conditional on verified identity, which requires more than a birth record that conveniently appears in a private cabinet after 20 years of... I expected this argument, Alara said. It was the first time she had spoken since entering the room. Hargrove looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating, again, the quantity and quality of what he was dealing with. Mr. Prentice will verify the documents, she continued. Independent verification of the handwriting, the registration records, the notarization of the marriage certificate. All of these are standard processes available under current law, and none of them will produce a result that contradicts what we already know, because what we already know is the truth. Hargrove was watching her with an expression that had shed, over the course of this conversation, a great deal of its affable construction. What remained beneath was harder and more revealing, the architecture of a man who had operated for 20 years from the certainty that the problem he had created was invisible and permanent. That certainty was dismantling in real time, and the face it left behind was not a pleasant one. "You are very certain of yourself," he said. His tone had acquired an edge. "I have had a great deal of practice being certain of very little," she said. "I find that when certainty is earned rather than assumed, it is considerably more durable." Hargrove looked at Dorian. The look between them was a different kind of exchange. The look of two men who have known each other across a relationship of power and had that relationship irrevocably changed. "You would do this," Hargrove said to Dorian. "You would dismantle this family for the sake of a girl whose origins I have verified," Dorian said, "whose birthright this house contains, whose life you arranged to erase before she was old enough to know she had a life worth protecting." His voice remained quiet. The quietness of it had, by now, acquired a weight that had nothing to do with volume. "She is Reginald's daughter. She is my cousin. She is a vein of this house, and she will be acknowledged as one." Hargrove's face had gone a color that was not healthy. He was standing very straight, the posture of a man containing something with effort. "I will produce a document," he said, quietly now, matching Dorian's quiet with a quiet of his own that was altogether different, the quiet of a threat being shaped. "I have documentation that establishes the union between Reginald and that woman as an arrangement that does not meet the legal standard for a valid marriage. Witnesses can be found. Records can be examined and found wanting." He paused. "I have resources available to me that would make any legal challenge protracted, uncertain, and extremely costly to pursue." The room was very still. "There it is," Ilara said softly. Not to Dorian, not quite to Hargrove, slightly to herself, in the manner of someone whose last remaining uncertainty has just been resolved. She reached into the pocket of her dress. She produced a folded piece of paper and set it on the desk beside the other documents. "Before we came downstairs," she said, "Lord Ashford sent an express to Mr. Prentice. In his own name this time." She allowed only the briefest pause on this, not enough for Hargrove to determine its meaning. The express requested that Mr. Prentice attend Ashford Hall at his earliest convenience, within the week, to receive into his professional custody, for independent registration and legal verification, the documents we have found. Additionally, she smoothed the paper, though it did not need smoothing. Additionally, Lord Ashford has written to the Bishop's Registry in London, where the original record of Reginald and Cecilia's marriage was filed at the time of the ceremony. That record, being filed with the Church, has been beyond the reach of private amendment for the past 23 years. She looked at Hargrove. "Whatever documentation you produce," she said, "will be tested against records that exist independently of anything either of us can touch. I am not uncertain about what those records will confirm." The fire in the grate made the only sound in the room for a long moment. Hargrove looked at the documents. He looked at Dorian. He looked at Ilara. And this final look was the longest and the most unguarded. And in it she saw, beneath the hardness and the calculation and the performance of affable authority that had served him so long, something she had not expected and did not enjoy seeing, because she was not a person who enjoyed others' suffering even when they had thoroughly earned it. She saw a man who had understood, in this moment, that the long game was finished. He crossed the room and picked up his coat from a chair where the footman had placed it. "I shall need some days to consult my own solicitor," he said. His voice was controlled again, the voice of a man retreating to the formal terrain as the last available ground. "Of course," Dorian said. "I trust the hospitality of the house will not be extended on this occasion," Dorian said. "I think you understand why." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them, the complex freight of a relationship that had been many things, and was now precisely one thing, and both of them knew it. Then Hargrove inclined his head with the formal courtesy of a man who had not abandoned the performance entirely, and he walked to the door. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around. He addressed the room with his back to it, which was, Ilara thought, the only honest posture he had managed all afternoon. She was not supposed to survive it, he said. His voice was low and stripped of its performance, the voice beneath the voice, the thing that had been operating all along. Cecilia was ill when the child was born. They both nearly. It was not supposed to be a difficulty that required managing. It simply persisted. The door opened. The door closed. The room held the echo of what he had said, the terrible, plain, administrative horror of it, in a silence that had no comfortable resolution. Alara sat with it. She sat with the knowledge that she had been, at some level of calculation, not meant to exist past the first difficulty that had seemed likely to remove her. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with hard things, meeting them directly, not flinching from the weight of them, not permitting the weight to become the whole of what she knew. She felt a hand, brief, entirely unannounced, entirely deliberate, close over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. She looked down. She looked up. Dorian was standing beside her chair. He had moved there without her noticing, which was, she thought distantly, remarkable, because she generally noticed everything. He was not looking at her with pity. He was not looking at her with the managed concern of a person performing comfort. He was looking at her with the direct, undecorated honesty that was his essential register, and his hand over hers was warm and very steady, and it communicated, without any words at all, the thing she had not realized until this moment. She had needed someone to communicate. That she was here, that she was real, that she had persisted against the calculations of a man who had preferred that she did not, and that her persistence was not a difficulty requiring management, but something else entirely. Something worth fighting for. Something worth standing beside. She turned her hand beneath his. Just slightly. Just enough. His fingers closed. Outside the drawing room windows, Hargrove's carriage was audible on the gravel drive, retreating down the long approach road away from Ashford, growing smaller and less significant with every turn of its wheels. Inside the drawing room, the fire burned. The documents lay on the desk in their careful row, and Alara Cecilia Vane sat in the house where she had been born, with her hand held by the man who had brought her home without knowing it, and felt the long, patient, compass-needle certainty of a person who has arrived at last at the destination they were always, in some essential way, always going. The week that followed Lord Hargrove's departure from Ashford Hall had the quality of a held breath, the particular atmospheric suspension of a situation that has reached its crisis point and is now waiting, with the patience of something that has already decided its outcome, for the formal world to catch up with what the essential world already knows. Mr. Prentice arrived on the Saturday. He was a small man, precise in the manner of someone who had organized his entire person around the avoidance of imprecision, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful movements of a man who understood that his value to the world resided in his attention to detail, and had therefore elevated that attention to something approaching a spiritual practice. He arrived with a leather case and an expression of professional neutrality that Alara suspected concealed, in its deeper layers, a considerable amount of barely managed astonishment. He examined the documents for 3 hours in the study, with Dorian present and Alara seated at the far end of the room, close enough to observe, far enough to allow the process its professional dignity. She watched Mr. Prentice move through the marriage certificate, the birth record, the correspondence, the placement receipt with its damning notation on the reverse. She watched his spectacles catch the lamplight as he bent over each document in turn, and she watched the quality of his silence change across the 3 hours, from the neutral professional silence of initial examination to something with more weight in it, more consideration, the silence of a man whose findings are resolving in a direction that is both professionally significant and humanly remarkable. At the end of the 3 hours, he removed his spectacles, polished them with a corner of his handkerchief, replaced them, and looked across the desk at Dorian. The documents are consistent with authentic origin in all material respects, he said, in the careful cadences of a man who chose each word with the awareness that it might one day be repeated in a court of law. The marriage registration is verifiable against the diocesan records. I have already communicated with the bishop's registry as a preliminary measure, and the record there is intact and consistent with what we have here. He paused. The birth record is in the correct official format for the period and location. The handwriting of the supplementary attestation on the placement receipt is consistent with the late Earl's hand, as I know it from other documents. Another pause. He looked briefly at Alara, with the expression of a man performing a professional duty that has acquired a personal dimension he had not budgeted for. The claim to the Vane Quarter, he said, is, in my considered professional opinion, legally sound, subject to the formal process of verification and registration, which I am prepared to initiate immediately, and subject to any counter-challenge. There will be a counter-challenge, Dorian said. Yes, Mr. Prentice said. I anticipated this. Lord Hargrove's solicitor contacted my office yesterday. He opened his leather case and produced a document, 3 pages, closely written. They intend to challenge the validity of the marriage on the grounds that a procedural irregularity in the registration renders it legally insufficient. It is, he paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who has professional opinions about the quality of his colleagues' arguments and is exercising restraint in their expression. It is a position that has been advanced with some ingenuity, but limited foundation. The procedural irregularity they cite was a standard feature of registration practice in the relevant year, and has been subsequently clarified by statute in exactly the way that favors validity rather than the contrary. Dorian read the 3 pages. He passed them to Alara. She read them. She looked up at Mr. Prentice. He intends to make this as costly and protracted as possible, she said, regardless of the legal merit of the challenge. The object is attrition. That would be my assessment, Mr. Prentice said, with the careful equanimity of a man confirming an unpleasant diagnosis. Then we will need to move quickly, Dorian said. What is the fastest available path to formal registration of the claim? Mr. Prentice told them. It was not, as legal paths go, a simple one. There were registrations to be filed, hearings to be scheduled, the machinery of the formal legal system to be engaged with the patience required of all things that moved at the pace of institutions rather than people. But it was a path, and it was clear, and Mr. Prentice was, Alara observed across the remainder of his visit, a man who had operated for 30 years in the space between what people wanted and what the law would allow, and had arrived at the view, apparently, that in this particular instance what was wanted and what the law would allow were the same thing, and that this alignment was both professionally satisfying and worth some personal investment of effort. He left on Sunday morning with the documents secured in his case, a list of actions to be initiated on Monday, and an expression that had, by the time of his departure, acquired something she had not expected at its outset, a quality of quiet determination. She watched his carriage from the entrance hall window, and thought that she had, in Mr. Prentice, an unexpected ally. She thought this as she stood at the window, and she thought several other things also, things she had been thinking with increasing frequency and decreasing ability to manage through the application of discipline alone. She had been thinking them since the drawing room, since the hand over hers, since the fingers that had closed and then, eventually, gently released. She had been thinking them across the strange, suspended week of Hargrove and Mr. Prentice and documents and legal strategy, in the margins of all the practical and necessary things that had occupied the foreground. She had been thinking about what happened now, not legally. Legally, she could see the shape of it clearly enough, the process, the timeline, the probable outcome. Legally, she knew what she was, and what she was owed, and what path led toward its formal confirmation. She was thinking about what happened now, between the 2 people who had spent the week sitting across desks from each other, and moving through East Wing galleries, and standing at drawing-room fireplaces with their hands briefly joined. The 2 people who had arrived at all of this from opposite sides of a fiction someone else had constructed, and who were now standing in the strange open country on the fiction's other side, where none of the old maps applied. She was thinking about the fact that Dorian Ashford had not, since the drawing room, returned to the administrative distance of their early acquaintance. He had not retreated to his controlled remove, his careful efficiency of manner, his policy of minimal engagement. He had been present, fully, specifically, deliberately present, in a way that was different from everything before, and that she had no available category for, because the categories she had developed were designed for a version of him that he had apparently, without announcement, stopped being. She was thinking about what that meant. She was thinking about the fact that she did not want to be wrong about what it meant, and that the prospect of being wrong about it was considerably more alarming to her than anything Lord Hargrove had produced, which told her something about herself that she was still in the process of fully acknowledging. She was standing at the window thinking all of these things when she heard his footstep behind her and turned. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, not a servant's presentation, but his own doing, the cups slightly mismatched in the way of things assembled without particular attention to the niceties. He looked at her expression, and then at the retreating carriage of Mr. Prentice, and then back at her. "He'll do well by us," Dorian said. "I think so too," she said. He offered her one of the cups. She took it, and their fingers met in the exchange, not the near miss of the oilskin bundle, not the deliberate but brief contact of the drawing room, but the ordinary, unhurried contact of 2 people passing something between them who have, without formally agreeing to it, stopped maintaining careful distance. She held the cup. She looked at the grounds. "I have been thinking," she said. "Yes," he said. "So have I." A pause. "About the same things?" she asked. "I would estimate," he said carefully, "that we are probably thinking about the same things. Though I have somewhat less practice than you at being certain of anything, so I may be wrong about the degree of overlap." She looked at him. He was looking at the grounds in profile. The line of his jaw, the dark hair, the expression of a man who is choosing his words with a care that is not his usual care, that comes from a different place than the precision he brought to estate business and legal documents. A more exposed place. A place that did not have the familiar comfort of professional competence to fall back on. "When I came to St. Agatha's," he said, "I was not looking for anything except the satisfaction of an obligation. My father's will required it. I had been for some time," he stopped, considered. "I had been managing things," he said. "The estate, the business, the days, managing them with a thoroughness that left very little room for anything that was not being managed. It was another stop. It was a kind of life that seems sufficient until something enters it that cannot be managed. And then you become aware, quite rapidly, of how many things you have not felt in quite a long time." Alara held her coffee cup and said nothing, because she understood instinctively that this was one of the moments where the most useful thing she could offer was the silence that allowed him to continue. "I pointed at you," he said, "because you were the only person in that room who was not performing for me. Every other child in that hall was angled toward being chosen, in the way that I am sure no one could blame them for. They wanted something desperately, and they were doing what desperation instructs. And you were sitting in the corner, reading a pamphlet." He paused. "About geology, I believe, as I eventually determined." "Limestone formations in Dorset," she confirmed. The almost laugh, fully present this time, and followed unusually by its complete arrival, a real laugh, brief and genuine, the laugh of a man who has stopped rationing them. "I said what I said," he continued, when the laugh had settled, "because I was uncomfortable with the fact that I had noticed you. I was not supposed to be noticing anyone. I was completing an administrative task. And there you were, entirely still, entirely unperformative, reading about limestone in a room full of children who wanted something from me. And I noticed you with a specificity that I was not prepared for and did not want. And so I made it small. I made you small." He looked at her. "The plain one will do." "You have mentioned," she said, "that you regret saying it." "I have not actually mentioned that," he said. "I have thought it continuously since approximately the second day you were in this house. But I have not said it." He turned toward her fully. "So I am saying it now. I am sorry for those words. They were the words of a man who needed you to be less than you were, so that his noticing could be less than it was. And you were never less than you were for a single moment, which made the words, even as I said them, a kind of lie I knew I was telling." Alara looked at him across the small distance between them in the entrance hall of Ashford in the gray December light, with his mismatched cups of coffee, and his unguarded face, and his careful, hard-won words. She thought about 3 years in an institution. She thought about the button sewn into a dress. She thought about a woman in gray gloves who had wept and said, "This is not what I want for you." She thought about a portrait in a closed gallery looking back at her with her own eyes across 20 years of silence. She thought about limestone formations in Dorset and inheritance law, on the third shelf of the south wall, and the frost on the Ashford grounds at first light, and Mrs. Brandt's expression on the day she arrived, and the Keats in her cloth bag, and the specific, compass needle certainty she had felt from the first day in the carriage that she was going somewhere she had always been going. She thought about all of it, in the way she thought about everything that mattered, fully and honestly, and without allowing sentiment to override the thing that was actually true. What was actually true was this. She had come to Ashford looking for her name. She had found it. She had come looking for her origin. She had found that too, in the East Wing cabinet, in the oilskin wrapping, in the brass plate beneath a portrait that looked back at her with her own eyes. She had found the shape of what had been taken and the path toward what she was owed and the evidence to pursue it. She had not come looking for this. She had not planned for this. She had managed against this with considerable effort and diminishing success across the weeks of library mornings and dinner silences and frost-bright afternoons and one extraordinary drawing room with a hand closed over hers. She had not planned for a man who laughed at limestone and brought coffee in mismatched cups and said you will be in the room without condition and stood beside her in the East Wing in the afternoon light and looked at her mother's portrait and said she looks like you in the voice of someone stating something that mattered. She had not planned for any of it. She looked at him. I don't think you chose the plain one, she said. I think you chose the one who wasn't performing. I think those are very different things. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. I understand that now. And I think, she said more slowly, choosing her own words with the care of someone who is saying something for the first time that has been true for some time, that whatever the legal resolution of the Vane Quarter claim, and whatever Mr. Prentice determines, and whatever Hargrove attempts, those are things I will attend to, because they are right and because they are mine to pursue. But they are not, she stopped. They are not the thing I wake up thinking about. The entrance hall was very quiet. What do you wake up thinking about? He asked. His voice had dropped to its lowest register. The voice beneath the voice, the one she had heard only rarely and only in moments that mattered. That is a very direct question, she said. I find, he said, that I have become considerably less interested in the indirect approach than I used to be. I believe I have you to blame for that. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been managing with great discipline and diminishing success perform its final complete, irreversible act of refusing further management. You, she said. She held his gaze with her gray stone eyes, her still face, her quality of absolute composure that was, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, composure over something genuinely warm rather than composure over its absence. I wake up thinking about you. The entrance hall of Ashford Hall, with its long rugs and its oil lamps, and its staircase sweeping upward beside its wall of portraits, held them both in the gray December light for one long, entirely still moment. Then Dorian Ashford set both mismatched cups of coffee on the entrance hall table with the decisive movement of a man who has determined that he no longer has a free hand and is rectifying this. And he looked at her with an expression that had nothing managed in it and nothing administrative and nothing cold, nothing of the man she had met in the orphanage, pointing at the girl in the corner with the voice of a man conducting an inventory. Only this. Only him, the real version, the one behind the armor, looking at her, as though she were the most specific and irreplaceable thing in the room. I chose you, he said. I didn't know it then. I know it now. He was close. The distance between them had resolved into something very small. You said the plain one will do, she said very softly. I was wrong about everything, he said, except the doing. You will do. He paused, and there was a warmth at the edges of his mouth that she had spent weeks watching arrive and retreat, and was now watching arrive and stay. You will do for everything. You will do for all of it. You will do. His voice dropped to barely above a murmur. For the rest of it, if you'll have me. Ilara looked at the man who had brought her home without knowing it. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she had decided was true, with the full, clear, undecorated honesty of someone who had stopped performing for anyone else's benefit long enough ago to have forgotten what it felt like. I'll have you, she said. The December light came through the entrance hall windows pale and clean and cold, and the portraits on the staircase wall watched with the accumulated weight of every Ashford and Vane who had stood in this hall before them, and the long case clock ticked its patient time, and Dorian Ashford leaned down and kissed her in the manner of a man who has been very cold for a very long time and has finally found, in the most unexpected of corners, a warmth he intends to keep. And Ilara, who had spent 3 years learning to disappear, who had been pointed at across a crowded room and found insufficient, who had carried a button and a name and a sentence against her skin like coals that would not cool. Ilara Cecilia Vane kissed him back. Not like a girl who had been chosen despite herself. Like a woman who had always known her own worth, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Spring came to Ashford Hall the way it always came to the English countryside. Not in a single declaration, but in a slow, accumulating insistence, crocus by crocus and degree by degree, until one morning you looked out at the grounds and understood that the world had, at some point while you were attending to other things, made its decision and was not going back. Ilara stood at the window of the Blue Room on such a morning, the last morning she would sleep in the Blue Room, as it happened, though she did not know this yet with the full certainty of an accomplished fact, only with the particular warm anticipation of someone standing at the threshold of a day they have been moving toward for a long time. The grounds were green. The oak beside the entrance was an early leaf. The fountain had been unfrozen since February and was running again, its small voice audible on still mornings through the glass, a sound she had come to love without noticing when the loving had begun, in the way that the sounds of a place enter you slowly until they become the sound of home. Home. She held the word the way she had once held the button, carefully, turning it over, feeling its weight and texture, examining it from every angle before she permitted herself to trust it fully. She had permitted herself, over the months since December, to trust it more and more. It was, she had found, one of the more demanding things she had ever undertaken, more demanding, in its way, than the research and the legal proceedings and the confrontation in the drawing room, because trusting required a different kind of courage than fighting did. Fighting, she had always known how to do. Trusting required the willingness to be wrong in a way that fighting did not. And she had spent a long time building the kind of internal architecture that was very good at avoiding that particular exposure. She was dismantling that architecture, wall by careful wall. She was finding it worth dismantling. The legal proceedings had moved with a speed that Mr. Prentice described as unusual, and Ilara described as the pace of something that had sufficient evidence on its side to make delay more trouble than it was worth to the people who might otherwise have employed it. Lord Hargrove's challenge had been filed, examined, and found wanting at 3 separate points. The procedural irregularity his solicitor had cited had proven, exactly as Mr. Prentice predicted, to be a standard feature of registration practice in the relevant period, and the church records confirmed the marriage of Reginald and Cecilia Vane in terms so clear and complete that even the most creative reading of the relevant statute could not produce the ambiguity Hargrove had required. 2 additional witnesses had come forward as well, former servants of the Vane household who had been located by Mr. Prentice through a process he described only as diligent inquiry, and which Ilara suspected involved the kind of tenacity that his professional manner concealed quite effectively. Both attested, in signed and witness statements, to the birth of a child at Ashford Hall in March of 1825. Hargrove had withdrawn his challenge in February, not gracefully. The withdrawal carried the quality of a man retreating from a field he had held for 20 years, which was not a quality that lent itself to grace. But, completely, he had retired to his estate in the north and had not been heard from at Ashford since. And if there was something almost anticlimactic about the formal conclusion of what had felt, in the living of it, like an enormous battle, Ilara had found this entirely bearable. Anticlimax, she had concluded, was simply what justice looked like when it worked properly. Not dramatic, not thunderous, just the slow, thorough settling of a truth into the space where a lie had been. The Vane quarter had been formally transferred to her name on the 14th of March, her birthday, as it happened, which Mr. Prentice had identified with the air of a man who appreciated a symbolic coincidence when it presented itself and saw no reason to resist it. She had turned 21 in the room where she had been born, and she had done so as Ilara Cecilia Vane, confirmed and documented and legally unassailable in the identity that had been buried before she was old enough to know it needed protecting. She had stood in the East Wing sitting room on that evening, beside the now open cabinet from which the documents had come, and she had spoken to the woman in the portrait in the way that she occasionally, privately, permitted herself to speak to the woman in the portrait, without expectation of reply and without embarrassment about the absence of one. She had said, "Asterisk, I have your name. I have your crest. I have the house where you lived." I think you would have found him adequate, though I would not tell him I used that word. Asterisk she had felt, in the way she sometimes felt in the East Wing, the specific warmth of a place that knew its history and had been waiting, patiently, for the history to be made whole. Dorian had left her alone there that evening. He understood without requiring explanation, when she needed the East Wing and what it meant to her to have it, the gallery, the portrait, the cabinet now permanently open, the sitting room's sheeted furniture gradually being uncovered and returned to use. He understood this in the way he was understanding, gradually and with increasing ease, a great many things about her, the particular stillness that meant she was thinking deeply, the quality of attention that meant she had noticed something she had not yet decided what to do with, the rare and specific expression that meant she was moved by something, and was managing the being moved with diminishing resistance. He was learning her the way she had learned him, patiently, specifically, with the close attention of someone who considers the subject worth the effort of real understanding rather than the efficiency of summary assumption. She found this, repeatedly and consistently, one of the most remarkable things about him. He had a mind that she respected entirely, and a heart that he had spent years pretending he did not have and was now, with the somewhat disorganized energy of something long suppressed, finding its release, discovering in full. This was the word she came back to again and again when she tried to account for him in her most honest internal register. He was real. Not performed, not constructed, not the administrative surface he had once presented to the world as his complete self. Real in the way of people who have stopped spending their energy on the maintenance of fictions and have that energy available, therefore, for the actual substance of being alive. She found she could not be objective about him. She had attempted objectivity in the early weeks after December as a matter of intellectual integrity, had attempted to assess him with the same analytical clarity she brought to everything, and had found that the attempt consistently produced something that was less like analysis and more like the warm, entirely unscientific acknowledgement that she was in no position to be analytical about this particular subject. She had decided that this was, on the whole, acceptable. Objectivity had its place. Its place was not, apparently, here. She turned from the window. Today was the day of the wedding. She had worn the word wedding carefully, in the weeks since Dorian had asked her, standing in the library, in the armchair, with the straightforward, unambiguous direction of a man who had decided that the indirect approach was no longer of interest to him. He had asked her directly. She had answered directly, and then she had said, "You understand that I am now a woman of some property and independent legal standing, so this is a choice and not a necessity." And he had said, "Asterisk, I understand it is a choice. That is precisely why I am asking." Asterisk, and she had felt the architecture of the last careful wall come down with a completeness that surprised her, and, she was honest enough to admit it, delighted her in equal measure. It was a small wedding. This had been her preference, expressed clearly and received without resistance. She had no family to fill a church, and she was not performing for a society that had not known she existed 6 months ago, and the intimacy of something small and genuine seemed to her immeasurably more true to the actual substance of a thing than anything done for the benefit of an audience. Dorian had agreed with the specific promptness of a man who had not wanted a large wedding either, and was relieved to not have to make the argument himself. The Ashford Chapel was at the far end of the West Wing, small, stone-floored, with pews for perhaps 30 people and windows of old colored glass that threw patterns across the floor when the light came through them in a certain way. Mrs. Brant had dressed it with winter-end flowers, early tulips from the kitchen garden's forcing beds, some branches of flowering quince brought in from the grounds, with the focused intention of a woman who considered this ceremony the culmination of something she had been watching unfold since the afternoon. She had looked at a 17-year-old girl arriving in a carriage and felt, beneath her professional composure, the specific shiver of something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when Alara descended. She looked at Alara in the dress, ivory silk, simply made, with a kind of clean, beautiful line that did not require ornament to make its point. And her expression was the expression of a woman who has maintained professional composure across 30 years of service and is finding it, on this particular morning, a more effortful project than usual. Your mother, Mrs. Brant said, and her voice was careful with itself, would have found you magnificent. Alara looked at her. You knew her, she said. Not a question. She had suspected it for months, had gathered it from 100 small evidences, had been waiting for the moment when Mrs. Brant would confirm it. I was her lady's maid, Mrs. Brant said, when she came to Ashford as your father's wife. For 3 years before, she stopped. The stopping had its own history in it. She was the most remarkable woman I have ever served. She was kind, and she was sharp, and she laughed at things other women in her position would have thought beneath them. And when you arrived in this house, she looked at Alara with those sharp eyes full of something she had been carrying for a long time. When you arrived, it was as though, she stopped again, breathed, as though the house remembered her. Alara reached out and took Mrs. Brant's hand. She held it for a moment, briefly, warmly, with the full and unperformed sincerity of someone who did not make such gestures often and meant them entirely when she did. Thank you, she said, for the blue room. Mrs. Brant composed herself with the practiced efficiency of a woman who did not generally permit her composure to wander, and was gathering it back from wherever this morning had sent it. It was the warmest room, she said firmly. As I said. As you said, Alara agreed. And then she walked to the chapel. It had snowed in the night, a late March snow, the kind that arrived as a final gesture of the season it was ending, laying itself over the grounds of Ashford in a soft white that was already thinning at its edges as the morning warmed. The path between the house and the chapel had been cleared, and the air was cold and clean and bright with the particular brightness of a snowy morning in early spring, when the white ground reflects the light upward and the whole world seems lit from below. She walked it alone. She had not needed anyone to walk it with her. She had been, for a long time, a person who walked her own way into difficult and important things, and she saw no reason to change the practice for the most important of all. Though she supposed, she thought, as the chapel door came into view, that she would not precisely be alone again after this morning, not in the way she had meant when she thought of aloneness during the St. Agatha's years, the fundamental solitude of a person without origin or anchor. She would not be that kind of alone. She found she did not grieve it. She opened the chapel door. He was there. He was standing at the front of the chapel in the colored light of the old windows, wearing a coat of deep charcoal that fit him with the same severe precision as everything he wore, and he was looking at the altar with the focused expression of a man attending to something he finds genuinely absorbing, which was, she had come to know, his expression in most moments that he was not performing otherwise. He heard the door and turned. He looked at her. Across the small stone length of the Ashford Chapel, with its early tulips, and its colored glass, and its 30 people standing in their pews, Mr. Prentice, surprisingly and touchingly present, and the housekeeper, and the estate staff, and the handful of tenants, who had come from the farms. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was the one he reserved for things he considered worth the full and unguarded attention of a man who had spent a long time guarding everything. She walked forward. She walked toward him through the colored light, the patterns of the old glass moving across the ivory of her dress, the stone floor cold through the thin soles of her shoes, the snow-bright morning coming in at the clear upper windows above the colored ones. She walked with the ease of a person entirely comfortable in the space they are occupying, in the body they are inhabiting, in the name they are carrying. She walked like herself. He reached out his hand when she was close enough and she took it, not the brief, deliberate contact of the drawing room, not the unhurried, ordinary contact of the entrance hall, but the specific, complete, permanent grip of two people who have decided. The chaplain, a small elderly man who had christened Dorian at this same altar and had been somewhat startled to receive a letter requesting he perform a marriage for a woman he had been unaware existed, opened his book and began. She listened to the words with the same quality of focused attention she gave to everything she considered important. They were old words, familiar in their cadence even to her, who had not grown up with them, beautiful in the way of things shaped by long use into their truest form. She felt them land differently than she had expected. Not as formality, not as the legal machinery of an arrangement, but as something that had genuine weight, genuine meaning, the specific gravity of words that are being said between two people who mean them. When it came to his vow, Dorian said it in the quiet, direct way of a man who does not ornament the things he means, simply and completely, looking at her with those dark eyes that had nothing managed in them, nothing performing, nothing of the cold remove of the man who had stood in a drafty orphanage common room and pointed at the girl in the corner. When it came to hers, she said it the same way. And then he reached into his pocket and produced the ring, plain gold, precise, entirely characteristic of him. And he took her hand and he slid it onto her finger and he paused there, his hand closed over hers. And he leaned down and he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, in the lowest register of his voice, the voice beneath the voice, the words that undid everything. Not the plain one, he said. Never that. The only one. She looked up at him. She had spent 3 years learning to disappear. She had refined invisibility to an art form, had made herself so small and so still and so thoroughly unremarkable that she had become, in that orphanage, a kind of ghost of herself, present without being seen, existing without being acknowledged, inhabiting a life that had been stripped of every marker that might have told her, or anyone else, who she actually was. She thought of that girl now, the girl in the corner with her geological pamphlet and her turned-down lamp and her button sewn into a lining. She did not feel, as she might once have expected to feel, the distance from that girl that triumph sometimes creates. She felt, instead, something continuous. That girl had been her, the same gray eyes, the same composed steady watchfulness, the same compass needle certainty pressing northward through all the accumulated weight of the not knowing. That girl had not been broken by what was done to her. She had been shaped by it into something precise and durable, and it turned out equal to everything the knowledge of her origin required of her. She had not been lost. She had been mislaid by someone who needed her to be lost, and there was all the difference in the world between the two. She looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at the man whose hand held hers in the colored light of the Ashford Chapel. She looked at the 30 faces in the pews, at Mrs. Brandt's thoroughly composed and suspiciously bright eyes in the second row, at Mr. Prentice's expression of professional satisfaction, softened at its edges into something warmer. She thought of Cecilia, her mother, her gray-eyed mother with her raised hand curved around its absent gesture, who had named her daughter for herself and placed a crest on a button and done everything, at the last, that she could do. She thought of the late Earl, who had written supplementary clauses and specified orphanages and tried, in his incomplete and compromised way, to draw the right girl home. She thought of the gray-gloved hands. This is not what I want for you. And she thought that she would, someday, find out whose hands they had been. She would find out because she was who she was, and she could not let questions remain unanswered for longer than the answers required to surface. But that was for another time. That was for the long and unwritten future that was beginning, as of this moment, in this chapel, in this light. Dorian was watching her think. She knew this because he had learned, as she had, to watch without intruding, to give the other person their thoughts and wait, with the patience of someone who has decided that what the other person is thinking is worth the waiting. She came back to him. Not the plain one, she said very softly. No, he said. The only one, she said. Yes, he said. She allowed herself, in the full light of the Ashford Chapel, in the presence of her name and her history, and the man who had brought her home without knowing it, with the snow thinning on the grounds outside and the spring pressing beneath it patient and inevitable, she allowed herself, completely and without reservation, to be seen. She had spent years learning to disappear. She found, on balance, that being found was considerably better. The chaplain said the final words. The old glass threw its colors across the stone. And in the East Wing gallery, in the gilt frame, with the gray eyes and the raised hand curved around its absent gesture, Lady Cecilia Vane looked out of the house where her daughter had been born and stolen and returned and claimed, and the house, which had known all of this all along, held them all in its old stone patience, and was, at last, entirely at peace.